Hey everyone, Charlie Morgan here, and welcome to Iterative Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance was a period of history that happened just after the Dark Ages, that was believed to have begun in Italy in the 14th century. And basically what happened is, we went through the Dark Ages where lots of bad things happened, to humanity. And then suddenly we had this exponential boom of creativity and creation and discovery, across not only art but science, and we made lots of progress real quick in a couple of 100 years. And iterative means to experiment and to test. Now, you might be slightly confused by this title, and you might be wondering, Charlie, what on earth does iteration and testing and experimenting and science and art have anything to do with me making money in a consulting business? Well, it has more to do than you could quite possibly imagine. And as I'm sure you've noticed by now, having gone through this sort of week one training, that things aren't as they seem. And a lot of the time, stuff that you think would be completely irrelevant to business and commercial success are perfectly related. And so what we're going to be doing in this video, and what I'm going to be explaining, is how to use the scientific method to get what you want and to become successful. Now, I need you to sort of see this in the same way that, I don't know if you've ever watched The Karate Kid before. If you haven't, I'll fill you in. But basically, in The Karate Kid, there's this kid called Daniel LaRusso. And then there's this sort of, kung fu karate mentor, right? And the mentor makes this kid, basically, like this kid goes to this mentor. And the kid's like, I want you to teach me karate. And, Mr. Miyagi, the mentor, is like, okay, I'll teach you karate. Go and wax my cars, and go and brush down my, my wood floors. And he gets this kid to do all these chores, and the kid does these chores for like a few months. And then the kid's like, comes to Mr. Miyagi and he's like, I don't want to do these chores. You said you were going to teach me karate. And then, Mr. Miyagi is like, show me wax on, wax off. And this kid does the motion with his hand that he would usually, that he would use to wax the car. And then Mr. Miyagi tries to punch him, and the kid uses this motion to block the punch. And suddenly in that moment, the kid realizes that he's been learning karate, but really what he's been learning are the fundamental movements of, the art, the martial art. And he's been learning karate, but he just didn't realize it. And that's kind of what these videos are, is like, you need to know these things and you have to get them. But until the end of this video, you're not going to really realize why you've had to learn it. And it will become very clear. There's a point in this video where it will just click for you. And by the end of this video, you will see business and success and the world in a completely different way. And it will open your eyes. But you have to trust me, and, you have to kind of believe me. We're going to go through some shit that you probably would think in a million years is completely irrelevant to business. But it is. I'm not going to teach you something you don't need to know. And there's going to come a point in this video where you kind of think, oh, goddamn, I get why he's taught this to me. Okay? You're going to have like that sort of epiphany. So that's the justification for the strange title. Here's what we're going to cover. And once again, you're going to look at this and be like, what? But trust me. So first of all, we're going to explain what iteration is. Modeling evolution, DNA, applied evolutionary biology, the scientific method, macro versus micro iteration, iterating towards goal, measuring experimental outcomes, metrics, asymmetry, and then we're going to get into the scientific method in a little bit more detail. So I've kind of put it here twice, but we're going to sort of explain what it is, and then later on we'll explain how to do it. And then variation. So without further ado, here we are. So, welcome to Iterative Renaissance. Here we will boil success down to a simple scientific model and formula and explore how to execute on it. And this is of extreme importance, okay? I cannot, I know I keep saying this and I keep saying everything's important, but you've got to get this right. So what is iteration? Well, iteration simply basically means gradual change over time. Now, your progress in business is going to be gradual. It's not going to be overnight or sudden. You're not going to wake up tomorrow with a six-figure income. It's just not going to happen. Now, you might wake up in a year or two with a six-figure income, but you're going to get there gradually over time, one little bit at a time. It's the same way as if you're trying to run a marathon. You can't do it in a minute. It might take you 4 hours, 3 hours, 6 hours, I don't know. Now, the only way to win in business and the only way to make progress is iteration. And every single thing that you observe that is good has typically come around or come about because of iteration. And so here are some examples of things that have been iterated to get to where they are today. So for example, democracy. As a species, and since the birth of civilization, all of 3,000-4,000 years ago, depending on which historian you ask, we've experimented with lots and lots of different societal structures. We've given ancient Greek democracy a go. The Romans had a different idea with the Senate and the Republic, and then we've had dictatorships and communism. Like we've really played around with this democracy thing, and in the West, democracy as we know it seems to function to a degree. And, that's the result of lots and lots of iteration over, like thousands of years of civilization. Another example is the iPhone. So, when you look at the phone you have in your pocket, it's kind of a marvel of engineering and brilliance. And like that thing didn't look like that when they first started making the iPhone. I've got the example down here, like, the iPhones that we know and love now, like they are leaps and bounds ahead of what they were at the beginning. But the only reason that they can be leaps and bounds ahead of what they were at the beginning is because they've had many, many different iterants and different variants as they've progressed. And Homo sapiens, so humans, we didn't just, come into existence one day. Well, maybe we did, depending on which religious text you ask, but that's up to you to decide. But from an evolutionary standpoint, human beings, like we've been iterated over time. If you believe the evolutionary theories, which I do, then we've evolved and we've changed. And so this is kind of the nature of evolution. Like everything that exists has gradually, changed over time to become unrecognizable to what it was at the beginning. Because if you took an iPhone 16 and you compared it to the first iPhone ever made, you wouldn't even put them in the same. They don't even look like the same product. And exactly the same premise that if you go to a zoo and you look at a monkey in a zoo and you look at yourself in the mirror, you're not going to see much resemblance. But you came from that, if that makes sense. And that iPhone came from that. And also cars, like, we started off with horses and now we've got, Teslas that, can do 0 to 60 in like 2.5 seconds or something. Like that's a lot of iteration to get there. And modern medicine as well, like, like tablets and pills and antibiotics, like, this has all been a result of one big test. And also everything else, like, everything else that you use and see in the modern world has been iterated over time. So what is iteration and how does it work? Because it is an incredibly powerful process. It is the process. And you can interchange the word iteration with evolution, but it's kind of the same thing. But really, to understand and apply iteration to business, we do need to dive into evolution, which is basically the most powerful iterative process on the planet. Like evolution as a force, as like a march of nature, is the thing that drives iteration. Now, this is going to be a bit of an abstract ride, and it's not going to make sense at points, but it will, and we will come full circle, and everything will be clear in due course. So bear with me, strap yourself in, and let's get into it. So modeling evolution. So understanding evolution makes you a force to be reckoned with in business. Now, yes, I'm referring to evolution in the same way that your, science teacher would. We're talking about the survival of, well, it's not actually the survival of the fittest. People don't really understand that. But in biology, in evolutionary biology, the term fitness or fittest refers to the ability to reproduce and survive. And so when we say survival of the fittest, from a proper biological standpoint, you're referring to survival of those who have the likelihood to reproduce. Fittest itself, like people think that it means like being fit and healthy. Not true, okay? Anyway, there's a little myth busting for you. So, in biology, evolution is the force that drives organisms to adapt to their environment and change, generation to generation over time. And this force is known as natural selection. So here's how natural selection works in a nutshell. So organisms of a species exist in an environment. And these organisms have different traits, and they differ slightly. So the species will, the same organisms, but they have slightly different traits. In the same way that, you're a human, and your best friend is a human, but you look different, but you kind of are the same thing. And so this is called variation. Traits are physical characteristics that are determined by genes. So you have your genetic genotype, you have your DNA, and your best friend has his or her DNA, and you share the same DNA because you're of the same species, but there's slight variations throughout that, genetic code that make you look different, and therefore you have different traits. So your friend might have blonde hair, you might have black hair. Or your friend might be 6 foot tall and you might be, 5'10", Some traits are better adapted to the environment than others. And so when we have different traits among a species, some members of that species have better traits. So the example I've given here is if we've got a population of mice, and this is mice of the same species, well, some mice of this species might have the genetic code for black fur, and other mice of this species might have the genetic code for brown fur. And so the black mice in this instance with black fur have an advantage. They are better adapted to the environment because the rocks that they live on are black, and therefore they are camouflaged. And so what this means is that the brown mice, the ones with the brown fur, are more likely to be predated on, tripping over my own words here, and therefore are less likely to survive. And so we would consider the black mice more adapted. And the organisms with the better adapted traits are more likely to survive, obviously. And then the organisms that are more likely to survive are more likely to reproduce. And this is called fitness. Now, the cool thing about reproduction is that, there's a few things about it. The first thing is that the traits that enable better survival get passed down to the offspring. And so if more black mice are surviving because they're being predated on less by the bird, because they're black mice on a black rock and they're not brown, then they're going to reproduce more. More of these are going to reproduce. And what that means is we're going to get more black mice because they're going to pass on their genetic traits. And we're going to repeat this over millions of years and thousands of generations to, get the species that we know and love and familiar with today. And, so for example, the modern day elephant that you should be familiar with, whether it's in India or Africa, they evolved from mammoths and different families of mammoths. And over time, nature decided that the length of their trunk would be a certain length and they'd be these massive animals that you can't even penetrate with a bullet. Well, maybe that's not true actually, but you know what I mean? All of these traits that they have, like the thick skin and all of this stuff, have been evolved over time to suit the environment. And so this is kind of it in a nutshell. A population of mice have moved into a new area where the rocks are dark. Due to natural genetic variation, some are black and others are tan. Tan mice are more visible to birds than black mice and predatory birds. Therefore, tan mice are eaten at a higher frequency than black mice. And only the surviving mice are obviously going to reach the reproductive age and leave offspring. And because black mice have a higher chance of leaving offspring than tan mice, the next generation contains a higher fraction of black mice than the previous generation. And this is how it works. So the environment sets the conditions for survival, and the organism must adapt itself accordingly. Now, you might notice this is kind of how I've taught you to come up with your niche and create everything so far. The niche and the market sets the conditions, and we must adapt ourselves to it. You cannot create your offer and the problem and the solution around yourself and what you think is best for you. You have to do it around the market. In the same way that if you're a mouse living on a black rock, you better make sure that you've got black fur and not brown fur. You might prefer to have brown fur and be like, oh, this brown fur looks way better on me, but you're going to get eaten and die. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather not have that happen to me. So there you go. So the environment sets the conditions for survival. And variation, which is basically just a result of the random mutation of genes, creates the genotype. So at a genetic level, your DNA or the DNA of an organism randomly mutates. So during the reproductive process, you have the male and the female, however controversial that might be to say these days, you have the male and the female reproductive cells. They merge together and they fuse, and then a new genetic code is created that has a lot of affinity to its parents, but is slightly different, which is why you don't look identical to your parents, right? And so this becomes the genotype, which creates the traits. So if your mum's got blue eyes and your dad's got blue eyes, and they reproduce, and you're a result of that, then you're probably going to have blue eyes, and therefore you have the trait of blue eyes as a result of your genotype. Okay. Now you could have brown eyes, and there could be some random mutation happening, from the reproduction. So yeah, that's that. Now, traits, which are physical characteristics and sometimes can also be behaviors, create adaptability. So how adapted you are is determined solely by what traits that you have. So for example, a trait of these mice is the color of their fur. And adaptability creates fitness. So remember when we said survival of the fittest? It's not fittest, it's not about which mouse has the lowest resting heart rate and is the fastest and can lift the most weight. and bench press the most. So that's a funny thought. It's about whether or not they can actually survive. Okay, like how fit are they to the environment? Do they fit the environment, basically? Fitness creates reproduction, and reproduction creates iteration. And iteration, which is basically just defined as a small change in a positive direction, creates evolution. So obviously nature doesn't recognize sentiment. Nature doesn't give a shit about the mouse, and anything. So when I say positive, I'm referring to this in the sense that we are making progress, but the only progress nature recognizes is progress itself. It doesn't care what it has to kill or take over, it's kind of ruthless like that. So that's basically the process of evolution. And, another example I can give you here are these little butterflies. So let's say we've got some butterflies of the same species. We've got the blue ones and we've got the red ones. And, the blue ones are going to create more blue ones with slightly different variants of blue, and the same with the red ones. They're going to create slightly different ones. And who knows, if the blue one and the red one mated, then maybe we'd get a purple butterfly, And basically, the thing about nature is we have limited resources. So all organisms in a species are fighting for limited resources, which is basically food, habitat, and mates. And so the butterflies that are better adapted will have better access to habitat, better access to food, and better access to mates to produce offspring. And therefore, the traits that are preferable to the environment will be selected for and accordingly will be passed down to their offspring. Now, to understand this in a little bit more detail, it does help to just take a quick look at DNA and what that is. So you should be familiar with the term, but DNA is essentially a biological or chemical molecule that carries genetic information for the development and functioning of an organism. Okay? It can be observed as a string of information combined together that basically codes for the organism. So in the same way that if you think about computer programming, and let's say that you want to program a game, well, you'd write tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions of lines of code to create that game. And it's kind of the same thing where your DNA is like a big line of code that basically it's basically like a binary structure, which means that I'm not going to get into it actually, I'm not going to confuse you because you kind of understand the premise. I could talk about it for hours, but it's wonderful. But basically, it codes for you, or it codes for the organism, right? Now, it's way more complicated than that, but I don't need to complicate this too much. Now, DNA is passed from one generation to another of a species via reproduction to offspring. Now, a species is a class of organisms with the same kind of name, right? Of the same kind with the same name, rather. So, for example, we are Homo sapiens. We belong to the species Homo sapien. That's our, taxonomy. Now, organisms of a species have physical and behavioral affinity, which means they're broadly similar. So, for example, if you observe elephants, that's like a species, right? Now, organisms have DNA, and this DNA codes for traits which are physical and behavioral attributes of an organism. For example, some traits for a human being could be eye color, or height, or being born with certain diseases, or the structure of your bones. So, whether or not someone is born with a really sharp jawline or not, or whether or not someone's born with a certain metabolism, or whether or not someone's born with sickle cell disease, or whether or not someone's like 7 foot, it's going to come down to the DNA and the random mutation of that DNA during the reproductive process, okay? Now, organisms obviously reproduce to create offspring, and we can see how DNA works here. So you basically have your body. Your body's made up of like lots and lots of these little things called cells. Inside of the cell, at a very, very small level, you have these things called chromosomes, and these are basically fractal pieces of they're fractal structures that basically contain the genetic code that just creates you, and you'll have different ones for different cells. Now, during the reproductive process, the DNA of a male and female is combined and randomly mutates, as I've kind of explained. This makes the offspring similar to, but slightly different from its descendants, and this is called descent with modification. So, when a woman and a man love each other very much, together they go and things happen and sparks fly and then a baby happens, right? And that baby will be slightly different to its parents, but it will still have similarities to its parents, and that's called descent with modification. And this is called variation, whereby all organisms of a species slightly differ. And it's really important that this happens because, the only way that evolution can work and iteration can happen and life can actually exist is if there's variation, because what variation does is it accounts for change. So if you've got, let's just say you've got 10,000 insects or ants, I can use the ant example. If you've got 10,000 ants, you want them all to be slightly different from each other, because then you've got 10,000 different, you've hedged 10,000 different ways. And so if the environment changes, there's 10,000 different variants that basically can be tested, and that way the species continues. If everything is the same, and we have, what you'd know in farming as monoculture, or in genetics as being homogeneous, I think that's the word, where everything's the same, then one change can wipe out the entire species. And so this is basically called being anti-fragile, or a little bit more robust, where variation is just the key to evolution, because without it, one change can wipe out an entire species. And this is why we differ. This is why all humans are different. It's why all organisms, at least observable ones, are slightly different in terms of size, in terms of traits. Because if you don't, one change comes along and it's good night. So even identical twins have slight mutations that make them differ. They're not, they might look identical, but they're still going to have different things because they're not carbon copies of each other. They might sound different. They might look slightly different. So what I want you to do is, I know we're in the weird biological abstraction stage, and I promise I will bring it back to business and everything will make sense. But we need to understand this, because I'm going to bring this into business in a second and it's going to blow your mind. So what I want you to do is think of organisms as made up of components. Now, component is not a biological term used to describe what an organism is, but it's just for the sake of simplicity, let's just pretend that it is. So these components are made up of more components, and the components that make up the components are made up of even more components, which are determined by DNA. Now, that might sound a little bit confusing, so allow me the liberty of blowing your mind. Well, hopefully I can do that with some slides. Now, we're going to use the example of an ant here, and I've got a diagram of an ant. So this is an organism of the species, let's just say Morgan ant, okay? And what we can see is the ant is made up of these different components. It's got different parts of its body. It's not just this, like ant is the collective term we use to describe the aggregate of all of these components, right? So let's look at how things change and evolve from the perspective of a diagram, okay? So, okay. Going to draw this point home for you. So here you can see an ant, okay, this black ant. And this is an ant belonging to the Morgan ant species, okay? So a species of ant called the Morgan ant species. Sounds kind of cool, I know. I definitely didn't name it myself. Now, this ant exists in an environment which sets the conditions for survival and reproduction. And so, you can see here, we've got this, I'm just going to zoom out slightly. Okay. So we've got the environment being the leaf, and the environment is basically setting the conditions for survival, okay? Now, the Morgan ant is made up of observable physical components, and these components are known as level 1 variables. And a variable is something that if you modify it, modifies the whole thing. And so what that means is that if you slightly modified one of these level 1 variables or components, then you would slightly modify the ant. So the ant is the macro, and it contains things. It's like a shell, and then the ant is broken up into head, upper body, mid body, lower body. And so, when we look at our diagram of what an ant is, we've got the head here, then we've got the upper body, we've got the mid body, and we've got the lower body. Obviously, we've got the legs and the antenna and stuff, but I'm keeping this simple, okay? So, ants made up of components. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because these components are then also made up of components. So level 1 variables, which are the big things, are made up of level 2 variables. And these are smaller, more specific components that are basically added together under a branch to make the larger component to make the ant. Now, here's the cool thing. If you want to change the ant, you modify the level 2 variable. Because when you modify the level 2 variable, then you modify the level 1 variable, and therefore you modify the ant. And I promise I'm going somewhere with this, so just bear with me for a second. Here's where it gets even cooler. So, below level 2 variables, we have level 3 variables. And level 3 variables are basically characteristics of level 2 variables that determine how they manifest in the organism. So if you modify a level 3 variable, which is all you can modify, then you slightly modify the level 2 variable, and then for the level 1 variable, and therefore the ant. So the way that things change and the way that iteration and evolution happens, naturally speaking, is on a very small level. So for example, if I said to you, let's change, like I want to evolve this ant and I want to change the way that its head looks. It's like, well, which part of its head are you going to change? Oh, I know, I want to change the eyes. Well, what about the eyes are you going to change? Oh, I'm going to change the width. So whenever we want to make a change anywhere, we have to bring it back to the smallest things possible and understand the relationship between those small things, the things that they make up, the things that those things make up, and so on and so forth. And evolution doesn't, like an ant's head doesn't just change color. Like a specific part will, and this is such a simplistic, reductionistic understanding of how an ant works. I looked into the anatomy of an ant for about 3 days to figure this thing out for you. Trust me, it was not fun. And it's way more complex than this, but there's literally thousands of these little level 3 variables that can be changed at a tiny little molecular level to change the ant, but I can't really fit that on a diagram, and I'm sure you're not that interested. So we're keeping it simple. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. DNA, right? DNA contains the genetic information that contains the code for the level 3 variables. And different parts of the DNA chain code for different level 3 variables. All organisms of the same species have similar DNA, but slight variations, meaning no organism has totally identical level 3 variable combinations, but they'll be quite similar. So in case you hadn't been able to sort of gather by now, level 3 variables that we can see here are essentially the traits. Okay, they are the traits of the components of the organism. And the DNA is the genetic information, and different parts of the DNA, as dictated or demonstrated here by these sort of like little branch node models, different parts of the genetic code for different traits in different level 3 variables. And so, for example, if we changed this part of the DNA here, like right here, then we might be changing the size of the ant's coxa, which is this part of its mid-body here. And you change the ant ever so slightly. And so what we've got on the right-hand side here is a diagram to demonstrate this. So the DNA codes for the level 3 variables and makes up the level 3 variables. Okay? So the shape of the eyes of the ant is determined by an ever so slight shift in the DNA of the information, or the information DNA. And the level 3 variables, they kind of make up the level 2 variables, and the level 2 variables, well, they make up the level 1 variables. And if we combine all the level 1 variables, then we get the organism as we know it. And so things are shells. You know when you hear about like shell companies, and I'm not talking about the energy company, I'm talking about like these big holding companies. So like, for example, in economics, we've got a company called BlackRock, one of the most famous companies. BlackRock owns BlackRock owns basically everything. So it owns all of these big companies, and all these big companies own all these brands, and all these brands own these subsidiaries, and all these subsidiaries own more subsidiaries. And so it's kind of like a shell structure in the sense that we have the big thing that contains the little things, that contains smaller things, that contains smaller things. This is called macro and micro thinking. And the reason I'm demonstrating this from the perspective of an ant is because when I bring this in and translate it to business, it will just click for you like that, because you've already seen it from a way more understandable perspective. And so the cool thing is that, if we want to change an ant, then what we need to do is we need to introduce something called variance or variation. And so there are infinite numbers, really. Well, maybe it's not infinite exactly, but, philosophically speaking, it's pretty infinite, right? There are an infinite amount of DNA variants and combinations that could mutate into an organism's genetic code to change the way that these variables appear at the level 3 level. And so this is kind of cool because, the variants that you can see at the bottom here, they are endless. And so, this ant can be slightly tweaked just on such a small level, something as small as eye shape, or something as small as, an ever so slight shift in the color of its antenna. And according to that shift and that slight mutation and variation, it could become slightly more adaptable, and that genetic code could be passed on to offspring. And this is how it works, right? Now, let me just throw a bit of a spanner in the works here. So what you can see in the top right is the leaf color has changed. So we've gone from a brown leaf to a yellow leaf. And what this now means is that the environment has changed. And, environments like to do this. Those bloody pesky things, boy, do they like to change. And so the environment's changed. We've gone from brown leaf to yellow leaf. And so, for example, let's say that the environment that this ant lives in is, on a tree, and a nearby farm pollutes the river that usually would provide the water for the tree. And, the pollution mutates the genetic code of the tree, which turns or bleaches its leaves and turns its leaves yellow. And so the ant now finds itself on yellow leaves, right? Now, here's where it gets kind of cool. So let's say that one specific ant of the Morgan ant species is born, or hatched, because I think they come out of eggs, right? They're not mammals, with a slight mutation. So in this new ant's genetic code is an ever so slight mutation that gives ascent to a more yellowish lower body. Just slightly. It's not going to be a huge change because it's only like one variation. But let's say that there's a random mutation, okay, at this level. And what this does is this changes the color code or the color of the postpetiole, which is the bulbous part of the lower body of the ant, and making it yellow. And therefore we have a version 2 of part of the lower body. And therefore we have a version 2 of the lower body. And what that means is that this ant is now going to appear physically different from the rest of the ants. It's less likely to be predated upon due to the fact that it's now more camouflaged on the new leaf color. And what this means is that this yellow lower body, this sort of version 2 of the Morgan ant, is now better adapted ever so slightly to the new change in environment. And what this means is that this ant has a better chance of survival because it's less likely to be eaten by birds, or it's less likely to be, predated on because of the camouflage. Therefore, it has a higher chance of, passing on its genetic code to the queen ant, or however the hell those things work, right? And, therefore a new version emerges. And before you know it, after plenty of reproduction and, generations, this trait will spread throughout the entire species because it's preferable and it's better adapted, okay? And so this is an example of how organisms change. It's the case where the environment changes, we get a random mutation, it changes one small part, which changes a part of that part, which changes a part of that part, therefore the entire thing, okay? And this is how adaptation works. Now, let's say that we've now got version 2 of this ant with a slightly, yellow lower body. And let's say that there's another random mutation, this time in the DNA code for the color of the antenna. Okay, so another pretty small component, right? Now, what's going to happen if there's another random mutation here is, we're going to get a different color of antenna. Okay, so now we've got version 2 of the color under the antenna, which means we've got version 2 of the antenna, which means we've got a brand new head version. So it's kind of like, how games get updated and it's like we've got a new head update. It's kind of how this thing works, right? And what this does is now we've got yellow antenna as opposed to black antenna you can see here. And this now creates version 3 of the Morgan ant. And so slowly over time through this random mutation and through these small changes up through the chain of, this macro structure, we get change and we get new variants and we get new versions and good things happen. Now, let me just pull this up, okay? So this is how all organisms have come to be, and it's called iteration. Now it's natural selection, it's evolution, but ultimately this is iteration. It's where we go from one version to the next version in a way that is positive in sentiment, where we're making progress. This is a gradual, slow change in a positive direction. Every single organism that you observe in the natural world is the result of millions of years of iteration, just like that example I gave you. And what's cooler is that this is still going on right now. You can't observe it because in your lifetime, we're not even going to change at all. Maybe we'll get, there's a theory for human beings that states that we are going to be natural. There's a theory for human beings that height is going to be naturally selected for, and if we survive this long in tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years to come, which is would be a pretty interesting thing. The idea is that it's going to be easier for us to survive and reproduce if we're taller, because as the planet heats up, if with the climate change thing, if that happens, then it's going to be easier for us to disperse heat through our bodies if we're taller. And so what some scientists think we're going to observe naturally over the course of lots and lots of generations throughout humans is humans are gradually going to get taller and taller and taller because that's more preferable to heat dispersion. Now, whether we believe that or not is up to discussion, but you get the point, right? The environment changes, accordingly we must change with it. And so this is how everything's come to be. If you look out your window right now and you see a tree, you should probably salute that tree, because that's like the perfect tree for the environment that it's in. It's been mutated and changed over and over again. And, it's the same thing with like any animal that you see. Okay. Now, this is where this kind of diagram demonstrates this point pretty well, because you can see we've gone here we've gone from the Morgan ant to like a brand new species, basically. And a species, like when it becomes completely unrecognizable or significantly unrecognizable from its previous descendant, it becomes a new species. In the same way that, we've gradually evolved from before Homo sapiens, we had a taxonomy. Our taxonomy before was Homo erectus, which I know sounds a little bit comical, but Homo erectus was basically the pre-Homo sapien, one of the pre-Homo sapien stages that basically determined like monkey standing on hind legs. And Homo erectus was one of the first organisms to have something called bipedal locomotion, which bipedal locomotion was a trait that basically stated that monkey can stand on two legs, and monkey can nearly run, and monkey can walk on two legs. And this gave us access to our arms, and therefore we could start to stand up, and then we could start using tools, and our brains would develop to use these tools, and that's how the brain adapted. And so the point is that we are Homo sapiens. However, we evolved from Homo erectus, but we got to a point in our evolutionary history where we looked so different, and we had such different traits from Homo erectus that we classified ourselves as a different species. Now, species classification is an abstraction, which means that it is not really real. We've just named it, right? But still, the principle applies here. And so if we applied, hundreds of thousands of years to the Morgan ant, we'd get something that looks completely different. And the reason we get something that looks completely different is because over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, the environment won't be the same. The only constant is change. The environment's not going to be static, it's going to change. So if you apply enough time and enough mutation and therefore enough iteration, an entirely new species can emerge. Okay, so like I said earlier, with the iPhone 16, it's almost like a different phone to the original iPhone. It's got some affinity, but, goddamn. Like, for example, the iPad is similar to the iPhone, but it looks different, and therefore it's called an iPad, not an iPhone. In the same way that a MacBook is not the same as a Mac. Like, they're made by the same company and they run on the same operating software, but they look so different that Apple have to, separate them in name, right? And so, that's kind of an explanation. So, as the environment changes over hundreds of thousands of years, the organisms, it might not be hundreds of thousands, could be tens of thousands or just thousands, but the organisms continue to adapt, and before you know it, you have something brand new that's not recognizable to its ancestor. And so what we can see here, for the Morgan ant, this would no longer be the Morgan ant species, but this could be version 373,248. Now, that's a bit extreme, but my point here is that all of this DNA is going to change, and we're going to get different variants of length, toxicity here, color changes 3 times, and this is what happens when you times all these experiments together, because we've got the head has gone through 48 variations, the upper body has gone through 24 variations, the mid body has gone through 18 variations, and the lower body has gone through 18 variations. And, if you times all these together, you should get this number. I think that doesn't look right, but I think that's right. Maybe it's not, but you get the point, right? If you times 4 by 6 by 2, we get 48. And so if we go through 4 variations of eyes, 6 variations of an antenna, and 2 variations of pincer, then we've been through 48 different iterations of head component, right? And the head component contributes to the ant, and if you put all these things together, then you get this variant of the ant. And so what we can start doing and what we can learn to do is placing this sort of version thing next to everything. And so everything has a version, and the version depends on how many experiments or tests have been run or how many iterations have actually been completed. And so this might be version 3, where we've got a slightly different color of body and a slightly different, type of antenna, different color of antenna. But this could be version 300,000, where now we've got 70 legs, we've got pincers on the back and we've got brown spots, and now we're releasing toxic chemicals and killing spiders, and the thing just completely changes. And so nature shuffles one variable at a time over a very long period of time to find the organism that is as near perfect as possible to the environment and its conditions. And natural selection and evolution, iteration, these are beautiful ideas. In case you can't tell, I get a little bit passionate when I talk about them. I think they're fucking awesome. And if you understand this and you if you really get this, and you really get to grips with this, it makes you an absolute weapon and force to be reckoned with in business. Because, well, I can explain. I'll give you some understanding. Okay. So that's basically the biology lesson in a nutshell. There's going to be a little bit more we have to discuss, but you need to understand this, because now we're going to talk about how to actually apply this. So applied evolutionary biology. So now that you have a basic understanding of evolution, we can actually put it to some use. So, we've gone through the wax on, wax off, and now I'm going to tell you to, show me how to paint the fence and you're going to block a kick or something, right? So you need to learn to see your business as a living organism with DNA, traits, variation, etc., etc. So when you look at business, you need to see it in the same way that you'd see a biological structure. So what I mean by this is, when we refer to environment in business, this is the market. So your niche, your competitors. The market is basically the sum of every individual human interaction, at every level, competitors, customers, etc. Right? And so when we look at the market, well, really you exist in an environment. In the same way that an ant exists on a tree, if the tree changes and it changes color, the ant must too change color, otherwise it will die. In the same way that you exist in a market, and if that market changes, you must adapt and change accordingly. And, in biology, we have this term variation, which is used to denote the, basically variety and having the variety to be, anti-fragile. And in business, this is new ideas, new tests, new things, new experiments, right? Genotype, DNA. This is the information used to create all of the variables in your business. So when you're creating your business, and when you're creating your offer and your avatar and your cold email systems and your sales scripts and your products, like, you're using information to do that. You're coding your business in essence. And so when you go through the offer training and I've given you all of the components of an offer, you're using your understanding of your market and and me and this program to code for an offer. And you're coding for a trait. So an offer in your business is like a trait, and that trait is going to be tested against the market and the environment. And if it's a good trait, if it actually works, then the market's going to respond accordingly. You're going to get customers, and that way that the genetic code of your business, this information you use to code the offer, is accurate and appropriate. And we're going to talk more about that in a second. Now, the traits are the characteristics of your business. So for example, if you have a great product, then that means that you've got a good trait. And so, for example, the Imperium Academy here with this program, in this academy, maybe it sucks. I don't know. I hope it doesn't suck, right? But I think with a bit of luck, this is a great product, right? And the only reason it's a great product is because I have access to the information to make it. So the DNA of this product is my decade-long experience making money online and teaching thousands of people to do it and doing it myself. And so, I can code for a pretty damn good trait here. Now, another trait you could have is bad customer support. So if you don't have the information available to you on how to accurately and properly support your customers, then you're going to code for bad support. And one of the traits of your business would be bad support. And so the way that we fix all of the problems in business is by, as I mentioned earlier on in previous videos, seeking out critical information and finding information that's appropriate, and coding that into your business and seeing that code manifest as a trait, testing that trait, and therefore evolving. Okay, in the same way that if an ant had the ability to actually look at the leaf, if the ant was like, oh shit, this leaf is now yellow, I'm just going to quickly change to being yellow. Like, if it could do that, then it would evolve way faster, and ants would probably take over the world. And this is exactly why humans have taken over the world. And it's exactly why we are the top dogs, and we are the most prevalent species, and we are at the top of the food chain in every way. It's because we have consciousness, and we have the ability to change like that. We have the ability to mold and adapt ourselves by using our brains and our consciousness. And that makes us, and we can't do that on a biological level. If there's a radioactive fallout and we have a nuclear winter, I can't just go into, well, maybe we can eventually, but I can't at the moment just go into my genetic code and code for, nuclear resistance. But what I can do is I can look at my business, and I can use my brain and my conscious mind to seek information to find new variants that I think would be appropriate and adaptable to the environment. Like when you get this idea, you just fucking get it. And like it will change the way you look at business and it will make you so much money. Okay. So anyway, so adaptability is your business fitting the market better and having traits that make it grow. Fitness is your business actually making money and being profitable. So, you know, in biological terms, fitness refers to an organism actually having the ability to, you know, reproduce and having the right traits. But in business, it's like, are we actually making money? And then reproduction, this actually happens in business. So this is other businesses copying your business traits. So by watching this video and by going through this program, like I am essentially like reproducing, like your business is going to be offspring of my ideas. And that's fine and that's appropriate and you want that to happen because I've tested my ideas and I've tested my business traits and the way that I think about business and I've made it work and I've made nearly $30 million at this point with these ideas. And so what I'm doing is you can now copy those traits and put them into your business in exactly the same way that an organism would sort of reproduce and, you know, come together and pass down to its offspring. So your business is sort of offspring of mine and you're going to go and find new things that work and then people are going to copy you. And this is how, you know, we see this evolution over time. And so iteration is the gradual change of your business over time in a positive direction. And this is basically evolution. And my business has been through thousands of iterations to get to the point where, you know, I can make, you know, $1 million a month. Well, actually it's kind of more at this point as of me recording this, and have, you know, these 50, 60% profit margins and, you know, basically just make an obscene amount of money at a young age. Like it's just, I've just iterated thousands of times and now I've found a sort of organism or a type of species that's just so perfectly adapted to the environment that it's ridiculous. And sometimes I have to pinch myself, but I'm sharing that with you. So in the same way that a species would develop and organisms would survive via natural selection, the same thing is true in business with business variables. So you know how we talked about this with the black mice and the tan mice? Well, it's kind of the same thing. Like the market selects, right? So the business exists in a market. All businesses have different traits, like different products, different marketing, different teams, different cultures. And traits are characteristics of the business which are determined by the available information that the founder has, which is why the quality of your business is determined by the quality of information you have available to you. And some traits are better adapted to the market than others. So for example, if I have a better product than you, then I'm better adapted to the market than you because that's a trait that the market's going to reward. And the businesses with the better adapted traits are more likely to survive, which basically means they actually make profit and, you know, the founder doesn't quit. And the businesses that are more likely to profit are more likely to be copied or emulated. And the traits from these successful businesses get passed down to new businesses. And then these new businesses are going to slightly vary on the ones prior to them. And then they're going to repeat. And so this is how natural selection works in business. And this is how we get these really unique and super powerful business models that come out of, you know, seemingly nowhere, but typically have taken, you know, decades to sort of develop. And, you know, this is kind of what happened with dropshipping. This is what happened with consulting. This is what's happening with school at the moment. Pretty interesting. And if you don't believe me, well, that's literally the process underpinning this entire program. Like, you know, this program is about to unleash a massive evolutionary wave of how to run this sort of online consulting business, this lean, hungry, mean, like, you know, 6 or 7 figure consulting business. And I'm literally doing this. I'm forcing natural selection into the market with this, and the market's gonna reward me over and over again accordingly. So here's where this gets interesting, because now you might be thinking, Charlie, just get to the point. So let's now visualize how a consulting business evolves. So in the same way that an ant with this PDF that you can click on here, that in the same way that we can see what an ant is made up of and how this thing would evolve over time, we can do the exact same thing with business. So if I just pull these slides up here, okay, and we come up here. So in the same way, you kind of recognize this diagram, right? So just like an organism, a business, version 1, exists in an environment which sets the conditions for survival. Now, the 2 primary conditions of the environment that you find yourself in are your niche and the problem that you're solving for your niche. And these are always present and always changing, right? So the problem might ever so slightly shift, or the niche might change. Not in the sense that, you know, you're changing the problem or you're changing the niche, but the needs of the niche are going to shift and, you know, you're going to have to adapt. And so in the same way that an ant exists on a tree, a business exists in an environment, and the environment sets the conditions for survival. Now, here's where it gets kind of cool. So just like an organism, a business is made up of components. Business as a term, or that's my business, if you point to something, you're pointing to a selection of components. Like the business is like a term that we use to tidily aggregate different systems together. Like a business doesn't really exist. It's just a word we use to bring some order to the chaos that is this string of components. And so a business is made up of components, and these components are foundations or macro systems, okay? They are known as level 1 variables. And really in your company, and I've actually mapped these out for you, these are the main components. So you have your avatar, right? Which is basically, your understanding of your niche and fleshing that thing out. And you have your offer, which is what you're actually offering to people. Then you have your outbound process, which basically refers to how you get customers using outbound methods like cold email, cold calling, or cold DM. And don't worry, you haven't done the training on this yet, so you don't need to worry about this, but you're going to have an outbound process. Then you have your content process, which is, making like the process you have for creating content to get leads through inbound systems like YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or Facebook groups. And once again, I'm going to show you how to do this, so don't worry, but you're going to have it. Then you have your sales process. Then you have your solution, and then you have your personal identity. So your personal identity is a huge one because that's a huge component of your business. Like you are the business. And so you have who you are right now, and you're probably going to have to change. And we're going to talk about this in the mindset module coming up soon. So don't worry about that. The same thing with your solution and your sales process. Like these are the components of your business. Now, as your business grows, you're going to add more components. Like for example, my business has probably got double these components because now I've got to think about like legal departments, and then I've got like sales management, and I've got incentive systems. So for the sake of keeping it simple and the sort of 6 or 7 figure level, these are the components you're going to have, right? You can also add team and stuff in here as well, but you get it, right? There's more components to an ant than just like a few, but I only put a few in because I didn't want to confuse you. So business, macro, components, micro. These are level 1 variables. And if you combine all of these variables together, we get the business. And so version 1 plus 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 version 1 equals business version 1. Now, here's where it gets kind of cool. These level 1 variables are made up of smaller variables. And these smaller variables are known as level 2 variables. So for example, your sales process that we can see here is made up of the script, the pre-call process, and your objection handling process. So when you're selling people, you need to have a script, you need to know what to do before the call to get them to show up, and you need to know what to do when they start having objections. And so if we want to understand how do we change the sales process, well then we either change the script, the pre-calls process, or the objection process. And so if we have a problem with sales, and sales is not working for us in our business, you don't just say, I'm going to change the sales process. You get specific. You say specifically which part of this sales process is broken. Because you might have the best script in the world, and you might be the best in the world at objection handling, but if your pre-call process sucks and no one's showing up, then, well, you're not going to make any sales. And so you're not just going to go and change your sales process, you're going to change a specific part of it, if that makes sense. And so please note that you can see on the screen these level 2 variables here. There is a lot more than this. There's hundreds of them that you can change in your business. There's hundreds of different little components that you can change. But I've only included a few just to keep it simple. And so for example, what we can see here is version 1 of your offer, or your offer is made up of your price, the time frame of the delivery, the outcome you're delivering, the methodology you use, the risk reversal process you use, the spin you use, the model you use, and then risk reversal is going to be made up of different things. So like what sort of risk reversal are you using? Like how are you framing it? How are you spinning it, right? So all of these level 2 variables, if we come on and move on here, contain level 3 variables. Now I couldn't fit them on the screen here, and there's tons of these. I've just given some small examples. So for example, like in your avatar, you might have a level 2 variable of what role models people have. And you could have level 3 variables around like different types of role models and what these look like. But to keep it simple, level 2 variables are made up of smaller level 3 variables. Some level 2 variables don't have variables inside them, but most do. So for example, a cold email, if we look here, we've got the outbound process, and part of the outbound process might be cold email. And cold email might be made up of the body copy, so the actual email that we send, the subject line of the email that we send, the deliverability. So if we're actually getting to the inbox, this is a whole thing. We'll talk about this in the cold email module, so don't worry. The lead source, so where you're getting the emails from, what software you use to send, what scheduling software you use, all of these little variables, contribute to the cold email, which contributes to the outbound process, which contributes to the business. And so this is the thing, is for your business to run successfully, all you have to do is get all of these little things right. And the way that you do that is by testing and experimenting. And so when we take another look at the ant and how this thing works, like this, for example, you can see the parallel. So we've got the organism, we've got the components, we've got the mini components, and we've got the variables of those components. And so if we want to change the ant, we drill down to specifically what we want to change, make a slight variation, and that changes the whole thing. And if we do enough of that, we get a brand new ant. And exactly the same thing is true in business. So, people think that building a business and becoming successful and getting rich in business is about making these huge, massive changes in decisions. It's not. It's just about making thousands and thousands of tiny right decisions every day and changing ever so tiny variables, and you'll smash it. And it can really just hinge on one thing. Let's say that in my business that I'm getting all of my traffic, all of my appointments from cold email. And let's say that I have got the best body copy, the best subject line, I've got the best lead sourcing, I've got the best software, but the only thing that I'm struggling with is actually delivering emails to the inbox. Let's say that my emails just aren't sending properly. I can have everything else in my business working. I can have the avatar perfect, the offer can be perfect, the content can be perfect, the sales process can be perfect, I can have the best product, I can be the best entrepreneur. But if one small little component isn't working, it's done. It's the same thing with a complex machine, like a car. If a car breaks down, it might just be because one small little nut or bolt came out. And business really is this simple and this straightforward. And so what we can do, in the same way that we looked at the ant and the organism and the DNA, is we can extrapolate that understanding back into business. And so we can sort of understand that your business has DNA, it has genetic information, in the sense that when you're making a decision to change a level 3 variable, one of these small things, the way you make that decision is based upon the information that you have available. And so if you're going to make a change at a small level in your business to change something big, you need to do it when you've got the right information. So coming back to the example of me making sure my emails are delivering properly, if I don't know, for example, with email deliverability, if you include lots of spam words in your emails, like free or 100% off or guarantee, if you use lots of spam words, then your emails will not deliver to the inbox. And so that is a piece of information that I know. And so when I'm modifying my deliverability variable for my business, I'm going to use that information accordingly. And that's what I mean when I say that the information codes for the business. You use information, which is basically your understanding of the way the world works, or the way that this specific discipline that you're trying to change works, and then you code. You use the information, you say, okay, in my email for deliverability, I'm not going to use these words because I have the information that tells me that if I do that, I'm not going to deliver properly. The same thing is true with objections. When you're coming up, for example, if we look at the objection version 1, we've got everything down to rebuttals. If I'm writing my rebuttals for my objection handling, and I'm basically, a rebuttal is if someone says I want to think about it, you need to have a way to handle that on the sales call so you can get them closed. Otherwise, they won't buy. And so when you're drafting up, your rebuttal process, a piece of information that helps there is understanding that before you introduce a rebuttal and tell them that they shouldn't think about it, you need to demonstrate that you understand and you have empathy. Because in order for us to change someone's mind, it helps if they feel understood to begin with. That's a piece of knowledge. That's a piece of information that we can use to code the way that we do rebuttals. Okay? And so it is literally information. The core of your business is information. So, for example, I've given you these examples here, right? But this is how it works. This is why if you just nail the information and you get really fucking good at finding good information and being right, and then integrating that information into your business, you change the small thing, which changes something slightly bigger, and then eventually you have a brand new business, okay? And it all comes around information. basically it's just be smart. So to change our business, we must seek critical information and apply it. Now, like I said earlier, unlike an ant, we don't have to rely on random mutation or variation for this. We can use our brains and our consciousness to find and apply the right information. If your objection handling variant in your business sucks and isn't working, i.e. you're getting loads of sales calls but closing no deals, then you can go and buy objection handling courses. Like we've got in Easy Grow, for example, we've got like an entire section dedicated purely to this. Or you can go on YouTube, or you can buy books, and you can start to seek information that you can use to then recode your objection handling variable to create a version 2 of that is more likely to be adapted to the environment. And so you can see these critical information variants demonstrated in the bottom of this diagram, where it is kind of like DNA. And so what we can start to do is, let's say, for example, that you've gone online, and let's say that you're on YouTube and you watch a video about how to structure your sales pitch, right? And you find it like a video from a really good salesperson on how to do something, a specific part of your sales pitch. Well, what you would do is you would take that information from that YouTube video and you would apply it to your business. And so you change the code of your business slightly, where now you make an amendment to your sales process or your sales script at a very specific point because of this information. And then what you're going to do is you're going to go to the market with this sales process, with the new variation, and you're going to test it. And you're going to do more sales calls, and you're going to see, do I close more deals by coding this piece of information in, or do I close less deals by coding this piece of information in? And this is how we grow a business. It's not through some crazy, wacky, woo-wah, amazing this funnel thing or this piece of copy. It's just small little iterations over time by defining the problem, seeking the information to solve that problem, applying it by recoding the variable and allowing that code to give assent to the result. And hopefully the result is better, okay? And, by changing the code of this thing, by watching the YouTube video on sales and changing the code of the pitch, we now have version 2 of our sales pitch, which now creates version 2 of our sales script, which creates version 2 of our sales process, which now creates version 2 of our business. And so you must learn to think in versions, okay? Where you've got version 1, which is where you are right now. You don't even have a version 1 yet because you haven't got all of your variables lined up. But when you finish this program and when you've been through all the videos and you've built the thing, you've now, all it is an experiment. You don't have a business, you have an experiment, okay? Once you've got the avatar, the offer, the outbound process, content process, sales process, solution, and your sort of personal identity in a row, this is a business, right? And all you're trying to do is not grow the business or become successful. You're just testing the variables that you've got. And if you don't get the result you want, i.e. you don't sign clients, you don't make money, all you do is you find out what about this chain of variables is not working. You drill all the way down to the thing that you think the problem is. You go and seek new information. You implant that information into the code of the variable that you think isn't working. You bring it back to the drawing board. You test the variables and the combination of variables again, and you see if it works. And that's all success is. If this isn't a penny drop, pin drop, aha, holy shit, epiphany moment for you, I don't know what will be. This is how you win. This is also why it takes a year or 2 or 3 years to get to that point where you consider yourself successful, because experiments and tests take time to run. Do not forget this. It's just information, applying it in exactly the same way that an ant would evolve. Like, it's the parallel between biology and business is insurmountable and, unarguable. It's just there, And so if we can learn to think like with DNA and variants and stuff, like, goodness me, you're going to be successful. If this variant works, obviously you're making more money. And most of the time, the changes you make are going to suck and they're not going to work. But sometimes you'll find something that does. So that's basically, in a nutshell, how to actually win and succeed. And if you know this and your competitors don't, you're going to crush them. Okay, and by the way, just so you're aware, this diagram took me an entire week to build. This idea of the ant and the variables and the micro macro shell based thinking and trying to bring all these parallels together. I understood this, but I actually spent an entire week on this one diagram that you see on the screen here and explaining it. So that's the level of importance that I want you to assign to this in your memory. Though I wouldn't have gone to that length of effort if I didn't think it was one of the most important things that you could possibly learn to grow a business ever. So here's some good news, right? So by using this program, your version 1 of business is probably my version 67. So whenever you buy mentorship, what you're doing is you're buying a version, right? So just by using this program, you have a huge head start, because my version 1 of all of these things here, like my V1 of of these variables sucked. My avatar version 1, like my V1 when I first started, was like 4 sentences. Now it's like 30 pages, you know? It's like tens of thousands of words almost. And like, you know, maybe not tens of thousands, but lots and lots of words, right? And so when you're creating your avatar using my framework, you're borrowing my version 67 or my version 85 or my version 93 or whatever. It's the same thing with, you know, like Easy Grow, right? So for example, in Easy Grow, I've done the maths here. I've tested nearly 100 different cold email scripts to find what works. So when you buy Easy Grow, which I'm sure you will in the future as you become more successful, you're just going to plug it, right? You know, no fucking shame in that. You know my intentions here. But when you buy Easy Grow, you're buying like a version. You're not buying a program or a course. You're buying a shortcut, because you could test 100 cold email scripts yourself, but to do that and stay sane, and trust me, it's not easy, might take you like 4 or 5 years. So by buying the program, you get where you would have got in 4 or 5 years in like 4 weeks. Does that make sense? So you're buying variables. And you know, my version in cold calling, I've iterated my cold calling script, and the cold calling scripts in Easy Grow have been iterated hundreds and hundreds of times. I've made tens of thousands of cold calls. And so in Easy Grow, your version 1 is going to be my version 128, for example. So this is how you make obscene levels of progress, and this is how you get rich real damn fast, is by just finding what works and then implementing it. And this is why we charge money for Easy Grow, and it's why we charge quite a lot of money for Easy Grow, is because it's really fucking valuable, because it can save you like 5 years of testing and suffering. That's pretty worthwhile, you know? Same thing for my content process. So in Easy Grow, we teach how to do content. And, you know, I'm going to teach you how to do content at a more basic level in this program. But if you want to get serious with it and really become a millionaire and shit, like, you know, you're going to get my my content process, you know, that would have been, like, your version 1 can be my version 13, and you can make 2 years of progress in like 2 weeks just by going through the content, right? So you're essentially, you know, it's a shortcut. When you buy things like Easy Grow, when you go through things like this program, you're basically just shortcutting how long it takes you. You can get to where I am probably a lot faster than I did, purely because, you know, you get to sit on my shoulders. And I think it was Isaac Newton that said this. He summarized this quite well. He said, if I see far, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants. And not that I'm a giant, and not that, you know, you should stand on my shoulders, because I've got a decent level of core strength, but I don't think that would be appropriate, right? This is how it works, okay? And this is the diagram. So, you know, in all of its glory, it took me this thing sent me to the darkness for a week or two. Like, trying to bring this abstraction out of my brain and my understanding of it onto one document. Well, that took quite some thinking. It looks simple, but this is the thing about teaching, and you'll learn this as you get clients and you start to develop programs in the future. Is teaching is about taking very, very, very complicated ideas and making them as simple to understand as possible. And, you know, the premise of this seems real simple to you now, but untangling that and making it simple is tough. And, you know, that's kind of summarized by Einstein's E equals mc squared. Like that, and then we've all heard of that famous famous equation before, but it summarizes a scientific theory that is so infinitely complex in like 3 words, like 3 letters. God damn it, like that guy was a genius. That's the sign of a genius, by the way, is being able to take really complex ideas and make them simple. This isn't genius level, by the way, like what I've done here. Like this is, I don't know, depends on what your perspective of genius is, but this is just like a genius invents this shit. Like Charles Darwin, for example, was the genius for, like, I based this thinking around his thinking, right? So, but yeah, that's kind of what you need to do if you're teaching. So you're welcome. Anyway, so the scientific method. So we're going to talk about the scientific method twice. Okay, so we're going to discuss it briefly now. and sort of we're going to talk about what it is. And then we're going to actually later on, after a little bit more context, explain how to do it. Because the way that we integrate information into the code of our business is by using the scientific method. There is a very, very, very specific way, a very scientific way that that this must be handled with, I think, 13 or 14 different steps that must be followed. If you just start trying to fuck around with your business code and your DNA of your business without the scientific method, you are going to burn the thing down and destroy it. And so you must follow a specific process. So we're going to get into that soon, but for now, let me get through the scientific method. So the big question that I'm sure you're now asking is, okay, well, Charlie, if building a business is just about finding the right variables, how do I do that? Like, how do I find level 3 variables that actually get results? And how do I know if new information is good or bad? Like, how do I know if the new code I've introduced works? And how do I build a profitable business? Well, the best business people are scientists, right? Like I said, not in the lab coat sense, but in the sense that they know how to test. They know how to experiment. And so you must learn to think scientifically. So I find it hilarious how, you know that sort of archetype in school, of the kid in biology or chemistry or maths or physics or geography. And the kid in school is like, oh, when am I ever going to use this in the real world? It's like that kid has no fucking idea. Like, I paid a lot of attention, in case you can't tell, I paid a lot of attention in biology and chemistry when I was 15, 16, because I knew that the rules of those games, the rules of those disciplines, of those studies can be carried across. And, I didn't know that at 15. I wasn't cognizant of that. But I had this idea that when I was like a kid, I could see the parallels between what I was learning in these disciplines. And one example, I was in geography and we were learning about coastal erosion. I think I was 15 or 16. We were learning about coastal erosion. And, we were learning about how different coastlines form because of the ocean and stuff. And, at the time, I remember when I was 16, this is when I was really starting to sort of get interested in business. And I was sort of trying to parallel that over. So I was looking at how businesses fail and how they erode over time. And then I was thinking, okay, well, coastal erosion is this gradual process that happens as a result of nature. And maybe that's the same thing is true in business with the way that things decay. And then I looked at history. So I've been doing this for a long time, but all of this to say that shit that you learned in school is actually quite useful if you just know what to look for and how to apply it. Another example, in chemistry, when I was 16, I learned about alloying. Alloying in chemistry is basically where you take two metals and you put them together to make a stronger metal. And that's like how steel is made, right? It's called alloying. And in business, one thing I've done is I've taken one cold email script and another cold email script that are totally different, so totally different elements, and I've combined them together to make the ultimate cold email script. That I've alloyed them together. And so I knew to do that in business because I remembered what I learned in chemistry. And so this is what I mean by thinking like a scientist. All of these things that you learn outside of business can be applied because business isn't real. Business is basically just a fucking amalgamate of variables and different disciplines. And if you become multidisciplinary and you learn all these different things, you can start applying the rules and you can destroy everyone. So not that you want to destroy everyone, but I mean, you can outcompete everyone, right? So instead of trying to build a company, what you need to do is imagine that you're running a series of experiments, okay? You're not trying to build a business. You're not trying to become, this entrepreneur. You're trying to become the best scientist and become the best at running experiments. And the iterative process is called the scientific method. So the scientific method basically takes on 4 steps. So step 1 of the scientific method is to formulate a hypothesis, which is a statement of, it's like a guess, basically. It's like a statement. It's a guess. It's like, I think if I do this, this will happen, right? So for example, my hypothesis could be, I think if I go out in the sun with no sun cream on today, with the level of UV that the sun is currently at, I will not burn. And then the step 2 is I will test that hypothesis. I'm going to go out in the sun for 20 minutes. And then step 3 is tomorrow I'm going to see if I'm burned or not. I'm going to observe the results. And if I do burn, then I'm going to formulate a new hypothesis, which will be, okay, well, maybe I need to go out with sun cream on, right? And so we have this 4-step process to scientifically test anything, and it's the same thing in business. So right now, if you're watching this for the first time, you do not have a fully developed hypothesis. You have your avatar, maybe you've got your offer done, but you haven't got version 1 of your product, you haven't got version 1 of your outbound systems or your content systems, you haven't got version 1 of anything else, that's fine. I'm not worried about you not having this yet, unless you're rewatching this video and you have it, then good for you. I'm worried about you knowing how to think iteratively for when you do try to build these things, okay? Because the reason I'm teaching you the scientific method and the iterative process is because it can be used for every single variable in your business. Like, how do you build a good product? You iterate it. How do you build a good cold email system? You iterate it. How do you build a good sense of identity and a good character and a good mindset? You iterate it. You make gradual small changes over time, right? Sometimes you can make extreme changes real quick and make a lot of progress real quick, but usually it's done slowly, iteratively. And so if you can learn the scientific method and you can understand it on a level that is deep and you can comprehend it with your brain properly, then when it comes to building these other variables in your business, you're going to fly by the iterations and you're going to make so much more progress. So the answers are all there. Everything you want lies on the other side of hundreds or thousands of little tests. Once again, like buying EasyGrow, for example, just means you have to do less tests. We iterate our way to success in business little by little. And so the way to look at this is to imagine that, we've got a version 1 of our business and we've got where we want to be. So we've got the crown. We want to wear the crown. This is the goal. And this is version X. So the only thing that stands between you and being where you want to be is a series of versions. And so version X could be like version 617. And there is a definitive number of versions that you have to run through to just get to where you want to go. And every time you test a new version and make an ever so slight incrementally smaller step towards your goal, you put a step, you take a step, you take a step, you take a step until you get to version, whatever it is, and then you're at where you want to be. All you have to do to get to where you want to go is iterate and change the version. Like the iPhone. How do we get to iPhone 16? Well, we start with iPhone 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, and so on. So version 1, the version, by the way, is the hypothesis. So when I'm talking about V1, this is hypothesis number 1. When I talk about version 20, this is hypothesis number 20. And a hypothesis is essentially a guess. So for example, I guess that if I line up this script, this subject line, and this lead source, and this deliverability method, and this software, I will get this result from my cold emails. And so this V1 or hypothesis 1 is the first version of your business after you finish all of your training. So a hypothesis can exist in the macro level or the micro level. And so this is demonstrated by this diagram here. So at level 1, with these level 1 macro variables that we've got here, if you string these together, you've got version 1 of your hypothesis. But each variable at level 1, as you know, is made up of the level 2. And so to code for level 1, we have level 2. And so we have our level 2 hypothesis, which creates this variable, which then creates this hypothesis, which creates the business. And it goes even deeper here where, the hypothesis goes to level 3. So you've got your level 3 variables here, and the hypothesis is the string of those. If you put them together, you're guessing it's going to work, right? That then creates a level 2 hypothesis, which is strung together with other level 2 variables, which then create the level 1 variable, which then is strung together with other level 1 variables to create the level 1 hypothesis. And so when we're running experiments and being scientific, we always iterate and change at the level 3 variable level. So we're going as low as we can to the minute details, but we have to understand the bigger picture that those are making up a bigger hypothesis, which makes up a component of an even bigger hypothesis, okay? So you will test your version 1 hypothesis as you go out to the market and try and make money and bank profit. But one thing is for sure, your version 1 hypothesis is not going to be perfect. So even when you've gone through this program, you're going to be way more successful and more likely to be successful having gone through this program than had you not. Same thing with EasyGrow, for example. You're just 10 times it's probably more like 1,000 times more likely to get clients and make a ton of money real quick. But the version 1 is not going to be the one. You're going to have to make iterations and so many changes over time because you've got different markets, different problems and stuff like that. So we just basically edge closer towards perfection through experimentation. And so version X that you can see up here refers to the hypothesis number that you will be at when you hit your goal. So for example, your version X for hitting $10,000 a month could be version 17 or it could be version 98. It really depends on how close you are. If your version 1 is real close to being what you need to be to hit 10K a month, then you might only need version 5 to get to 10K a month. But if you didn't have this program, then your version 1, whether you know it or not, you've got a version, right? Your version 1, maybe you'd need like version 683 just to get to 10K a month, right? So it depends on how close you were when you begin, but this version X refers to like what version you'll be at when you hit your goal, right? And it depends on when you're starting. This is also another reason to not quit, by the way, because every time you switch niche or quit or change, like you go back to version 1 and all these steps you took, it's kind of stupid. So not everyone starts equally in business. So you might look in the community and you might see some results from the academy or from the program. And you might see that some people are making more progress than you. You might see people going from 0 to 10K a month in like a month. You might get stressed out and worried. But not everyone starts equally in business. So don't be surprised if some people get there in less versions than you. So business is like a 100-meter race, but unfair. Some people, when they get into business, are going to start at the 90-meter line. So they're going to start 10 meters away from the finish line. Some people are going to start at the 10-meter line. So they're going to be a little bit further ahead. Some people will start middle way through the race. Like when you're starting business, you're not, if you take 1,000 people and they're all trying to do this program, you are all at different levels. Some of you have done like things before. Some of you have done nothing before. Some of you are able to articulate yourself. Some aren't. Some of you have really good English. Some of you won't. Like you're all going to have different variables, and therefore if you're all in the same race, some of you are going to start further ahead than others, and therefore you're going to finish faster. That's fine. For example, let's say that someone does this program, but they've already worked in sales for 5 years. Like they won't need much iteration to find out what sales system is going to work. And maybe someone starts this program and they get into the same niche as you, but their parents are people in that niche. They're just further ahead than you already. They just are, And so you can't compare yourself to other people in the program and base, their progress on your progress, because where they started is totally different. It would literally be like lining up to race someone against 100 meters, and then you start at the 0-meter line at the beginning, and they're starting at the 58-meter line, and then they beat you, and then you're like shocked and surprised, like, what? How are they further ahead than me? It's like, well, they started like halfway further than you, right? So if basically the point I'm making here is that if someone is achieving things faster than you are, it could be because they're working harder than you. That's a huge variable, because the harder you work, the faster you can test. That's all hard work is, by the way. It's just faster experimentation, putting cause to effect faster and finding the thing that works faster. But like if someone's further ahead than you, it's because maybe before they started, they've already done a bunch of experimentation. Like your version 1 and their version 1 are completely different in how close they are to the goal, right? So version 1 is not this universal thing where everyone starts at the beginning. Like if someone in the academy has access to Easy Grow, then their version 1 is going to be so much closer to the goal than yours is, because they've got such an advantage because of the depth of information around acquisition in there, right? Or the depth of acquisition around cold email or sales or whatever, right? And we're going to get into that in this program, but I'm just going to give you the basics, right? And then Easy Grow will take you to that point where you're making like millions and millions of dollars, right? Or multi-six figures. So macro versus micro iteration. So we can think about the iterative process in the macro or the micro. So macro is big and micro is component of big, relatively smaller in size to big. And so, when we're looking at this diagram here, we've got the business, which is the macro, and then we've got the level 1 variables, which are the micro, which are part of the business. But then what we can do is we can also see level 1 variables as the macro, and then we can see level 2 variables as the micro inside of the macro. And then what we can also do is we can see level 2 variables as the macro, and we can see level 3 variables as the micro inside of the macro. And then we can take it further and see level 3 variables as macro, and see the DNA or the genetic information or the information we're using as the micro inside of the macro. And so to give you a little bit more tangible examples, or a more tangible understanding of this. So the universe, as we know it, is the macro, and our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, is the micro. And you could see the Milky Way galaxy as the macro, and the solar system is micro. So micro is part of macro. So our solar system could be the macro, and Earth could be the micro. Like Earth is part of the solar system. And Earth could be the macro, and Europe could be the micro. It's relative in size. And then Europe could be the macro, and UK, the country of the UK, could be the micro. And then the UK could be the macro, and Somerset County could be the micro, and Somerset's the county that I grew up in. Big up Somerset. Just thought I'd throw in a little bit of Charlie Morgan trivia for you there, but Somerset's like a place in the UK, and so like it's inside of the UK, and the UK is inside of Europe, and Europe is inside of Earth, and Earth is inside of the solar system. And so this is how, you know, we need to start thinking, is like macro, micro, like components. So if you want to change the big picture, you have to change the components of it. In order to iterate the macro, you must iterate the micro. And the easiest example that I can explain here is, if you want to win a war, you just have to win the battles. So what is a war? Like a World War II, what is that? Well, it's not really anything. It doesn't really exist. It's just basically the name that we use to label a bunch of battles. And so if you want to win a war, you win the battles, and battles are the micro component of the war. And so it's the same thing. Like, I can't stress this enough. If you want to fix these big things up here, you fix these things here, and by fix these things here, you fix these things here, and to fix these things here, you fix this thing here. You know, you drill down, you get real specific with it, okay? So for example, the DNA string of your business, or the variable string of your business, are these things, as we know. And this is the macro hypothesis of your level 1 variables. And as an entrepreneur, obviously you want to grow your business and make it better. And so, you know, you're going to iterate the variables. You're going to iterate your hypothesis. And so we take the hypothesis of the macro variables of the business at level 1, and we change the sales thing. So now we've got version 2 of the business, you know. But in order to change the sales variable up here, then we need to change the level 2 variables of the sales variable, which are script, objections, and pre-call. And so, you know, we're going to come in and we're going to do that, and we're going to iterate it. But in order to change one of these variables, we have to change a level 3 variable, which are here. And so let's say we change the pitch. And so by changing the pitch, then we change the script, which is the level 2 variable, and so on and so forth. I've already explained this in enough detail, I think, but you can just read through this real quick if you want to understand it. But this is how we change from version 1 of the business to version 2 of the business to version 3 of the business, and so on and so forth. Now, it is possible to work on different parts of your micro hypothesis at any given time. So for example, like, you know, if your macro hypothesis of your business, which, you know, once again, are these level 1 variables here, if these aren't really working and you're not getting the result you want after a month or 2 of testing, then maybe you need to change your offer, but you can also change your personal identity or your sales process or your outbound process. You can change all of these things in conjunction to each other. And so I do this all the time in my business where, you know, if I want to make changes, I might be working on my ads and my content and my mindset and my product and my sales team all at the same time. Like you can run multiple experiments at once, but what matters is you're not running multiple experiments in the same place. So if I'm changing something around my sales team, I'm only going to change one thing. I'm not going to try and run multiple experiments in the sales team at the same time, because then I'm going to get confused if I won't be able to determine the cause of the effect, right? But what I can do is I can change like something about my mindset, and then I can change my diet around as well. I can also change the offer and how that works. Whilst I'm changing the offer, I can also change my YouTube style, because these things are all independent, and I can, you know, shuffle them accordingly, if that makes sense. Generally speaking, it helps just to do one thing at a time, but at the big level, you can change multiple things at once. So changes in a localized hypothesis must not be interfered with. So for example, I can change my content process and my product at the same time, but I wouldn't change 2 things about my content process at once. And I'm going to explain why in a second. When we get into the actual process of the scientific method, I'll explain this. So just bear with me, but it should make sense in due course. So iterating towards goal. So the whole point of iteration is to achieve a goal, right? The whole point of changing this thing and making these changes is so you can get towards what you want. And so your business should have an overarching goal, right? And, you know, we can talk more about this in the mindset module and finding out what you want, but you should kind of know what you want. You should have a goal. And so for example, you know, $100,000 a month. Now this would be the goal of the business in the macro sense, because thinking in micro and macro also works in terms of goals. And I'm going to explain this to you here. So what we would refer to a goal as is a North Star or Polaris star. So when sailors didn't have navigational equipment, when they didn't have compasses and, you know, radars and stuff like that, and they were sailing in sea and trading in the seas, what they would do is they get their bearings by using the North Star. And so that was their sort of, you know, that was the thing that they based all of their decisions around, was like, how do we get to where we want to according to the North Star? And so your macro goal, being your financial goal, is made up of mini micro goals that must all be hit to make it happen. So you know earlier how I said that to win the war, you just have to win a bunch of battles? Well, if you want to win the war, which is your macro goal, to be victorious in the war, then all you have to do is win the battles. And if you want to win the battles, then all you have to do is win all the skirmishes, right? So the point here is that if you hit all of your micro goals, the macro goal will be hit. So like, for example, let's say that you want to be healthy. And let's say that your goal is to live to 100 years old. Well, living to 100 years old, the way that you do that is by taking care of all of your micro health goals. So for example, it's making sure that you're exercising regularly and you're maintaining a certain weight, and that your bone density is in a certain place, and that your nervous system's in a certain place. And so these big goals, these big aggregates are basically made up of smaller goals that, if hit, will achieve the goal. So getting to 100K a month is not about getting to 100K a month. It's about doing lots of small things and achieving lots of small little goals that make that up, that make that happen. So your goal is an outcome of an aggregate of all your micro hypotheses. Your goal doesn't really exist, and neither does your business. You know, goal and business are words that we use to summarize and sum up the parts that make them. They're effectively collective nouns. So I'm going to give you this visual to help you understand, because this is we're going to get a bit abstract and it can get a bit confusing. So if your goal is to make 100K a month, you know, and that's your version X, what you need to do, then, you know, maybe to get to 100K a month, all you have to do is nail your avatar, get your offer right, get your outbound process right, get your content process right, sales process right. And if you get all of these metrics, you know, and you hit all of these goals and these are individual little components of the business, then you'll hit 100K a month. So let's visualize this. So here's an example, 100K a month business. Now, you know, your avatar. So if you get your avatar to the point where it's 10 pages long and it's 85% accurate, we've hit the avatar goal, right? And your offer. If you have such a good offer that your click-through rate on ads or YouTube videos or cold emails or whatever is 3%, which means that 3% of everyone that sees your offer actually want to book a call, then, you know, we consider that a goal. So one of your goals in business is to achieve this click-through rate. Now, by the way, these numbers are arbitrary. I've made them up. I'm not saying this is what you should aim for. We'll talk about what to aim for when we actually get to the specific systems, but that you get the point. For example, the outbound process. Your goal with the outbound process is to get a 5% appointment booking rate, which means if you call 100 people, 5 of them want to talk to you and book a call. Or your content process. Maybe your goal is to get to 100,000 different views per month on your videos. Or maybe your sales process. The goal could be to get to a conversion rate, get your sales skills to a conversion rate of 25%. Or maybe your goal with your product is to sell people into your product and to have a refund rate of less than 5%. You know, or maybe you have a goal for your mindset and your identity to become a person who's consistent. If you'd hit all of these smaller goals and you did all of these things, 100K a month would naturally manifest. And so you don't chase your big goal. You set it there as your North Star, as the thing that you use to help you orient yourself, you know, in this metaphorical ocean that is business. But if you want to achieve that, it's as simple as achieving all of these small little things, okay? And we achieve those small little things at these micro levels, okay? So if you want your business to be successful, then you need to have a successful offer. And if you want your offer to be successful, you need to have a good outcome. And you fight all of these little battles, and then you win the war, okay? So war, like I've said, is a label used to collect a bunch of battles. And in business, the battles are all of these different little variables. Now, this is the version of the hypothesis required to achieve said micro goal. So VX is basically what I'm referring to there. So sorry, I skipped this part. So you win a war by winning battles. Win enough battles, you win the war. You'll notice how each micro goal here on the right-hand side has this version X. So once again, whilst we have a version X for your overall goal and where you want to be, we have a version X for every small little goal as well. And if you hit the version X and the iterant, you know, the iterative process, if you iterate enough inside of each little component and you get to where you want to be in each little component, then you will manifest the entire thing. Now, I know that this is getting repetitive and it might be a little confusing and you might need to watch this section back a couple of times. I'm doing my best to explain a very complicated abstract term. Please bear with me, okay? So like I said, achieving your big goal is as simple as achieving lots of small ones by attacking them one at a time. And by attack, I just mean iterating, testing, and experimenting with new hypotheses. Success is incredibly easy and simple when you compartmentalize your objectives and look at them as small little problems to figure out. Figure them all out, line them up in a hypothesis string, and you will have a successful business. And the hypothesis string, by the way, is just like when you sort of visualize all the variables put together. And you literally iterate your way to success. The only kicker here is it just takes time. It takes years to get to these things. And you might have heard the phrase before that the only way to eat an elephant is one small chunk at a time. It's the same thing. Like getting to 100K a month is like eating an elephant. Like to do this thing, you have to break it down. Like what's everything I need to have in place to get to this point? And then you break those things down, and then you break the things down inside of those things, and you get to the real simple little pieces, and then you just attack these tiny things. Because you can eat an elephant if you're only eating like little bite-sized pieces. It's just going to take you a long time, but you can do it. It's exactly the same thing with building a business. Like all of these little problems are quite easy to figure out. It's just that there's lots of them, and they take a lot of time, and you need to attack the small things. Okay. So measuring experimental outcomes. So the big question then becomes like, how do you know if your iteration is working? like how do you actually know if a new hypothesis is good or bad? So as I've discussed, a hypothesis is basically a guess. And it's like it's a statement of like a guess where it's like, okay, well, if I do this, then this might happen. But how do you know if a hypothesis works or not? Like what makes a hypothesis at any level, whether in the macro or the micro, good or bad? Well, as we now know, we have goals at multiple levels. And I want you to start thinking about it like this. So when I use the word goal from now on, the goal is transcending the levels. So it could be the goal of getting to 100K a month, or it could be the goal of getting to a 25% sales conversion rate, right? When you can test at multiple levels, therefore we have goals at multiple levels, and we have KPIs at multiple levels, which are key performance indicators. And this will all become clear as I go through this diagram, okay? So think about it like this, because this diagram can be extended to understand the nature of experiment at all different 3 levels of variables, okay? So we've got level 1, level 2, level 3. If we want to know an experiment's working or not, because we're going to experiment at these different levels, then we can use this diagram, okay? And I know this is getting a little confusing, and this is one of the hardest things for me to explain to you. So please, if you feel confused and it's taking a minute for you to understand, just rewatch the whole video. It's really important you get this, and I appreciate you bearing with me. So here's how it works. So this is how you can measure the effectiveness of an experiment. So we have the goal, and we have what we would refer to as hell, determined by this fire, right? The red arrow refers to regress, and the green arrow refers to progress, and the black line with the version next to it refers to the baseline. So you have where you are right now. So whenever you're conducting an experiment, or whenever you're about to begin a new experiment, you have your baseline. And your baseline is determined by your current hypothesis. So the current variables that you have, okay? Version 1. Then you have where you want to be, which is your goal. And then you have where you don't want to be, which we're going to call hell, which is below your baseline. So, if you bring in a new experiment, and you bring in a new set of variables, and you bring in a new hypothesis, and you test something new, you're bringing in like version 2. And if by introducing version 2, you move away from baseline towards your goal, then we are making progress. But if by introducing version 2, we move away from baseline towards hell, then we are making regression. And so, when you introduce something new to your business, it's either going to bring you closer towards your goal or push you away from where you are right now towards hell. Or it's going to keep you at the same level and keep you the same. So to make this concrete, for example, let's say that, like I said earlier, I find a new piece of information on how to handle objections on a sales call. And let's say that I implement that information into my sales process and I experiment with it for 30 sales calls. And it's quite a big change to my objection handling process. Let's then say that over those 30 sales calls, I make less sales, okay? Because I introduced this new objection handling variable that I found on TikTok like an idiot. And so what's happened by introducing this new variable is I have regressed. I've made less money. I've made less progress. I'm moving away from where I am right now, away from my goal towards hell. So this is important to understand because most of your hypotheses or hypotheses, to use the plural, are going to force regression. Most of the times you're going to be wrong. Pretty much 95 to 99% of the information that you find online or anywhere is going to be wrong, with the exception of programs like this that have been thoroughly thought through and actually tested. Because think about it. If you go on Facebook and find someone doing something, and then and you start copying that, how do you know it's going to work? Like, you have to test it, of course, but most information out there is wrong, and most people are wrong about everything all the time, constantly. And so if you're not careful and you start making new variables and introducing tests, you're just going to be moving further and further away from your goal. And so, let's say, for example, that your goal is to make 10K a month, and that your baseline, which is where you are at right now, is 1K a month, and hell could be debt. So, let's say that you're in a job right now and you're making $1,000 a month, and, your hypothesis is to start this business, right? And, the way I've structured this program is so much in the fact that it's not going to send you into stupid amounts of debt, right? So you can't go to hell. The only way you're going to succeed with this program the only progress you're going to make with this program is progress. You're not going to regress at all. And that's what makes a good product. And so, you have where you are, you have where you want to be, you have where you do not want to be, which is below where you are right now. And every time you introduce a hypothesis, you've got to measure it accordingly. And so version 2, the next hypothesis, is either going to move you towards, away, or stay where you are. Okay. This is how we basically measure the outcome of an experiment. Okay. So anytime you test something or introduce new information, it's going to do one of these 3 things, and you need to be watching it like a hawk to make sure that you're making progress and not regress. Okay. So, let's say that we introduce a new variable to this experiment to create V2, and let's say that we introduce version 2 like this. And, we've now introduced version 2, and by introducing version 2, we've moved slightly closer towards our goal. And so by virtue of progress, which we can visualize here, by version 2 bringing us above the baseline, version 2 is better than version 1. So therefore we lock it in and we create a new baseline. And this is how you make progress, is you introduce a new hypothesis, you pop it in. If it makes progress, then you stick to that hypothesis. If it doesn't, then you go back to version 1 or the version before that, and then you continue. And so, here's the thing, right? So, we've gone from version 1 to version 2, and we've increased our baseline towards our goal, but we're still not at our goal. We're still quite far off of our goal. There's still a lot of progress to make here. And so let's say that we introduce version 3, which is a new hypothesis, and, so we bring in version 3 and we test version 3, but then version 3 was actually worse than version 1. So this happens a lot. Like, just because you're introducing new versions does not mean they're going to work better. Like, new is usually bad, So we would reject the hypothesis of version 3 and go back to version 2, and then we would create a version 4, and then we would try again and again and again. And so, for example, right, let's make this concrete. So let's say that this is the current baseline for how many appointments you get from your cold emails. Okay, cold emails are a nice, easy example. So you're getting this many appointments. So the goal is to get 100 appointments a month, and hell is getting no appointments a month. And so right now you're getting like 50 appointments a month, but you're not getting enough, right? So you introduce version 2, and you change your cold email slightly, one of the variables to change that system, and therefore you start booking 60 appointments a month. You've just ever so slightly increased the amount of appointments you're getting, which is perfect, right? But then you think, okay, well, I'm onto something here. I'll change it again. But then by making that change in that month of that change, now you only book 20 appointments. So you need to have the awareness and the cognizance basically to recognize when a change is driving regression as opposed to progression. And so, this is kind of how it works. Like you can map your hypotheses on the trajectory towards your goal. So most hypotheses, most new information, and most new hypotheses and new variants that you introduce will fail. And most of them will drive regression away from the baseline before them. This is the point of an experiment. So now we would know, for example, that cold email number 3 is way worse than cold email number 2, and it's even worse than cold email number 1 was, okay? Because we're below that baseline. And so after doing this for some time, you can start to map the results of your various hypotheses, always setting the baseline at the newest height and testing from there. So, for example, here is an experiment with 12 different variants, and let's say this is a cold email experiment. So we start off with version 1 baseline, where we're booking 50 appointments a month, and we introduce version 2, and version 2 moves us to 60 appointments a month, but still not quite there. Well, version 2 becomes our new baseline, and then we think we'll test version 3, but version 3, as we know, brings us to 20 appointments a month. So we think, okay, shit, we'll go back to version 2, but we're going to run an experiment. So When you're running an experiment, what you're doing is you're still running version 2 at this point. So if something's working, you never stop running it ever. You just introduce an experiment like separately to it. So if I'm running a cold email campaign that's working, I'm never going to turn that off. If I want to try a new cold email campaign, I'm going to create a new one and run that as a new experiment. In the same way that, if a scientist is trying to measure the growth of a bacteria, he's going to get them in a Petri dish and he's going to put some stuff in a different Petri dish to test the effect of that stuff as opposed to the stuff before it. So what I'm saying is when you've got something that works, never stop doing it. If you want to test it and try something new, then you run a different experiment. And this is explained in more depth in Easy Grow. This is something that to really grasp and to really understand, like you can get the basics of it like this, but if you really want to become an absolute expert in this thing, it takes like 15 hours of explanation. So we'll get into that later. But anyway, so version 3 is, shit, doesn't work as well, below baseline. So we try version 4, which is also worse than version 2. So then we try version 5, which is actually better than version 2. So our new baseline becomes number 5. And then from version 5, we try version 6, which is way worse than version 4 was and better than version 3 though. So, version 6, it still hasn't got us towards our goal. So we try version 7, which works slightly better. And then version 8, which works the same as version 1. And then version 9. And this is how progress looks, is you iterate, and it's not going to be this like neat little tidy jump towards goal. You're going to go up and down. But what matters is you remember the highest point and you always maintain that as the standard. Like the people are just sometimes idiots where I've seen this all the time with like people who test things and like they just end up forgetting what works. So like they'll have version 1 which works better than their version 6, but for some reason they're running version 6 even though version 1 worked better. and they're like, oh, but it's version 6, so it must be better. It's like, you're an idiot, like it doesn't work. So you can visualize it like this. Progress is never a straight line, and you always want to raise that bar, raise that baseline, and measure every experiment that comes against it past the previous highest point. Okay? Now, in summary, your business is simply one big experiment with a North Star, which is your overall overarching goal, like 100K a month or 10K a month. To achieve the North Star, we must conduct various smaller experiments, because that's how you do it. And these smaller experiments are made up of even smaller experiments. So for example, if the North Star of your business is to make 100K a month, then a goal that you're going to have to achieve to make this happen could be 100 appointments per month. And that's at the outbound cold email level. And a goal that you're going to have to achieve to make this goal happen is getting 10,000 people to open your emails per month. So this is my point, is goals are like, they are fractal insofar as the fact that the big thing needs a little thing to happen and the little thing needs a littler thing to happen. You have to learn to think in macro, micro, micro, okay? And so the variables of the cold email open rate are going to be deliverability, the subject line, the lead sourcing, the email name, the structure, the personalization. If we get all of these little things right, then we're going to get this thing right. And if we get all of these little things right, then we're going to get things at this level right. And if we get all the things at this level right, we're going to get this thing right. This is literally just building a house. Like, you don't build a house, you just lay tons of bricks. And building a house is about building lots of different little rooms. And if you get all the rooms built, then you have the house together. Like, these big things, these macro things are just collective names for little components. And, if you're building a kitchen, now you need to build the sink, and now you need to build the island, then you need to build the dining table in the kitchen, then you need to build the oven, and then to build the oven you need to build the handle on the oven, and you need to build the grill in the oven, and to build the grill in the oven you need to build the little slats, and we build things by building small things. That's the whole point of this entire video, is just to explain that one point. And if we get the small things right, the bigger things fall into place. And it's really easy to build the small things. Like, figuring those little small things out are really easy. What's hard is trying to do it all at once and getting confused. But if you can see it in the micro, it's really fucking easy. Now, so this is how it works, right? So we've got the goal at the business level, and we're going to measure our progress towards our goal or regression towards hell at the macro business level, which is basically how much money we're making. And then the business goal is made up of lots of micro goals, and we're going to measure these micro goals and the variance and the hypotheses of these micro goals in either direction. And then the micro goals are made up of even smaller micro goals. And we're going to measure these in different directions. And so all of these make up this, and all of this makes up this. And that's how it works. Now, I know that this is a hard thing to grasp, and I've tried my best in making it as simple and understandable as possible. What I need you to know is that Easy Grow, specifically for acquisition, goes into absolutely ridiculous detail specifically on this topic. We are scratching the surface on this whole scientific method experimental thing. To give you some context, in Easy Grow, we've got a module called Acquisition Genesis, and I've got, I think, like 7 or 8 videos dedicated purely to better understanding how this idea works. Because you get the basic of it. The basic of it is fine to get, and you can get a couple of clients. You can get you get yourself started with the basics. But if you're serious about building this business thing, and you're serious about getting to that sort of 10K a month, 30K a month, 50K a month, 100K a month, if you want to just get a couple of clients and chill, absolutely fine. But if you want to actually build a business, you need to understand this on a level that is much, 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 much more advanced than this. And so that's what I've kind of done with Easy Grow here, is I've got these videos from Acquisition Genesis, and these are all dedicated, like 3 hour long, 3.5 hour long. Like all of these videos are dedicated to expanding on these topics in way more detail. Because I can cover it in one video here, and I can give you the high level overview and give you a basic understanding. But this shit goes really deep. Like, for example, in this video here, in Acquisition Genesis, we've got iterative Darwinian acquisition. And this explains how to use the scientific methods specifically for one component of client acquisition that you have to understand. And so I'm trying to give you as much as humanly possible in this program, but I don't want to overwhelm you just yet. I want you to get your foundation straight before we get into the deep shit. So I just want you to know that this goes far deeper, and there's far more to know about this than what I've just told you. But what matters is you've got a deep enough understanding to make decisions and become successful. But if you want to get to millionaire level shit, multi-6-figure level shit, that's that sort of laptop lifestyle thing, then you need to know more. So just a little disclaimer, okay? So metrics. So a metric is a term you should be familiar with. It's basically a measurement. And the easiest way for me to explain how metrics work, and once again, there's a 4-hour video in 3.5 hour video in Easy Grow dedicated to explaining metrics, but I'm going to give you the overview, and then you can get into more detail if you want to in Easy Grow. But metrics are basically measurements. Okay, so I'm going to give you an easy example and then explain it in business terms. So your body is a system made up of other systems, and the functioning of your body can be measured by one simple metric, which is your heart rate. So the first thing you would do to see if someone's alive is check their pulse. So this is called a primary metric, and in biology it's known as a vital. So how do you know if something's working or not? Well, you have to measure it. Okay, it is impossible to know if something is working or something is functioning properly if you don't have a measurement. So the only way that for us to, if you walk into a room and someone has collapsed on the floor, the first thing you're going to do, and the first thing that an emergency services person will ask you to do, is see if they're alive. And the first thing you're going to do is take a measurement. You're going to take a measurement of the metric of their heart rate, because that's the first thing. Is their heart beating? That is the first thing that you check to see if someone's alive or not. And so the same thing is true in business, where the first metric we use to measure if a business is being successful or not is whether or not it's profitable. And we'll get into that in a second. But my point here is that the heart rate is the first thing we measure. It's a primary metric. Now, inside of your body, you have lots of other systems, because the body is, once again, it doesn't really exist. The body is just the term that we use to collectively describe all of the biological systems that make you up, right? And so inside your body, you have lots of systems. You have your skeletal system. And the metric that you would use to measure whether or not your skeletal system is healthy is bone density. So the mineral density of your bones. If you've got a problem with your skeleton or a bone problem, then the first thing the doctor's going to do, or the osteopath is going to do, is measure your bone density. And so metrics are measurements that we can use to assess the effectiveness or function or quality of function of a system. And the nervous system, your heart rate variability, which is the amount of time between heartbeats, and how much variation we have there is a measurement of your nervous system. And your cardiovascular system is measured by stroke volume. Don't ask me what it is. I just found it on Google. Respiratory system is measured by your respiration rate. So, if you go to a doctor and, you've got a problem with your lungs and, you've got like an issue, pain in your lungs, they're going to measure your respiration rate, which is basically how many breaths you're taking per minute. And digestive system, microbiome diversity will measure this. Reproductive system is going to be measured by your sperm count. So if you're a man and your doctor wants to get a measurement of your of the effectiveness or the function of your reproductive organs, then they're gonna measure your sperm count, right? And that's like a pretty straightforward test that a lot of people do. And so, not to get too inappropriate, but we're all adults here, right? We can all move on from that. But literally, God, I'm 26. How old am I? But anyway, my point here is that all of these things, all of these components, like all of these things are inside of the body, and we can take a measurement of each system in the body by looking at one metric. And now there's more to it than this, but you get the point. Every big or little system in your body has a metric attached to it that will allow you to assess whether the system is functioning properly. All of these systems in your body must work. All of these systems must work for the body to work as a whole. If one of these systems stops working, then we die. Now, maybe not the reproductive system, but if your respiratory system's fucked or your nervous system's fucked, you're going to either suffer immeasurably or die, right? Now, you want to approach business the same way that a doctor would approach a patient with a health issue. So if you've got a problem in your business, if your business is not growing and it's not profitable, then you need to find out why. And the easiest way to find out why is to measure it. And so, this is why if you call up 911 or 999 and you ask for an ambulance and the person on the phone will ask you, is their heart beating? Are they breathing? Like, is this person actually alive? Is there any point in us even sending out an ambulance in the first place? It's kind of what they're asking you there. And, if yes, then they'll send out paramedics, and then the paramedics will, run some tests and find out what's wrong with this person. And the only way to find out what's wrong with someone is through tests. And so you have symptoms, like, for example, you could have a really bad cough. So you'd go into your, doctor, and they take your respiratory rate, they take your VO2 max, which is like a measurement of, how effective your lungs are at processing oxygen or something like that. I can't remember. And then they'll get measurements, right? Then if something's working or not. Now, the same thing is true in business. So your business is made up of systems, and the functioning of your business can be measured by one simple metric, which is how profitable this thing is, or really it's profitability / income. Like, how much money are you actually making? Now, if we're measuring a consulting business, then we're looking at income and profit. So, for example, a consulting business that's making $100,000 a month with a 70% profit margin is going to be better than a consulting business making $5,000 a month at a 15% profit margin. Like, the functioning of that business number one is better than business number two. And so we measure the success of our businesses by profit and income. Now, if you're looking at a software business and like a portfolio company, you look at like market cap, and it gets weird and different, but just to keep it simple, we're using profit and income. The first thing you would do to see if a consulting business was successful is look at income and profit. Okay, and I'm just going to highlight this. So, this is really the first thing you do. Like, if someone came to you and said, is Charlie's business successful? You would run that by the fact, how much money is he making and how much money is he keeping, right? And, depending on your perception of success, you probably would say yes. If you think $1 million a month and $500-600 grand a month is successful, then, you kind of get the point, right? So it's pretty straightforward. Like, you start with this primary variable. This is the vital. This is how we know, is our business successful or not? Is it profitable and is there income? Then our income and profitability, in the same way that our heart rate is going to be determined by these systems, because if your nervous system's screwed up, then your heart rate will be off. Same thing if your respiratory system's all messed up, your heart will be working faster, right? And so each system in your business can be measured and tracked by a metric. So your product system is measured by your refund rate. Your ad system, if you're running ads, which you won't be for a long time, but if eventually you do end up running ads in your business, then your ad system is measured by your return on ad spend, which means how much money do you make back if you spend $1. So it's called ROAS. It's how you print money. You'll learn to do it in EasyGrow. Cold email is basically measured by appointment booking rate, and your sales system is measured by your sales conversion rate. Once again, in the same way that with your body, if one of these systems is out of whack in your body, then the body won't function properly and you'll really suffer or you'll die. In the same way that with your business, you've got all of these systems and there's like a dozen of them. It's not just these 4, there's lots more. And if one of these isn't functioning properly, then the business is going to suffer immeasurably or it's going to die. And so the point here I'm making is that the primary metric that we use to measure success is an amalgamate of all of the smaller metrics that we use to measure success at a smaller local level. And to measure if systems are performing, we use something called key performance indicators. So a key performance indicator is basically a standard that we set that helps us know if we're performing or not. Think of a KPI in the same way that those sailors would think about the North Star. Like, how do I know if I'm going in the right direction? Because if you don't have a key performance indicator, like how the hell do you know if you're healthy or not? Like, for example, they say that a healthy adult male should have a heart rate of roughly 60 to 70 beats per minute. So if you don't know this and you measure your heart rate and your heart rate is 125 beats per minute, you don't know that you're unhealthy. You don't know that your heart rate's abnormal. You need something to compare it to and contrast it against. And this is why, like, you know, in science and stuff, like, you know, with like obesity and, you know, all of these problems that people have, it's like the only reason you know you're obese is because you're heavier than the average person. And to be fair, a lot of the average is definitely increased over time. But, you know, we have metrics like body mass index and other metrics to use to measure the effect of weight and how heavy someone is on their health. And so, you know, you can use those metrics and those measurements to determine where you should be. And for example, you know, the KPI in your system, and I'm going to color these ones in because you know how much I like my color. The KPI of the system for your product in your business is a refund rate of less than 5%. So if your refund rate in your business is higher than 5%, then you are out of KPI, which means that you're doing something wrong. So KPI metrics are like, these are feedback mechanisms. They tell us what's going on, right? So if in your body, for example, if your bone density is really low, then that's a sign that your mineral uptake it just sucks. And like, you know, if you go to an osteopath, which is a person that works with people who have shit bones, basically, it's probably not a nice way to put it, but someone who's got like weak bones, like they'll take the measurement, and if the KPI for bone density is +1 and you come in at -3, the only reason that osteopath knows that you're abnormal and that you need to fix it is because you're not where you should be because of what they know is healthy for everyone. Okay? So that's how we use key performance indicators. And whenever you're running experiments or, you know, trying to become successful in making tests and stuff like that, you must learn to look at this, like, to look at these KPIs and to understand, like, what the hell are you actually aiming for? Because if you don't know what you're aiming for, then you're gonna miss because you're not even aiming for anything. So we're gonna also touch on asymmetry real quick. This is another mental model that is explained in Easy Grow in like a 4-hour video, 3-hour video. But anyway, so the thing is there are an infinite number of experiments that you could run at any given time. So the question becomes, like, how do you know which ones to run and when, and how do you know what to focus on? Like, this might be a question that you're thinking about right now. It's like, if there's like hundreds of variables in my business, how do I know what to work on? Well, what you need to learn to do is focus on things called asymmetries. So asymmetries are certain things in your business that if you work on, move the needle the most. So you'll hear me use this phrase a lot throughout the training, which is move the needle. And this basically means, like, there are certain things in your business that will move you towards your goal if changed faster than other things. And this is called leverage. So leverage is basically defined as something getting you what you want. In this case, it's moving you towards your North Star goal. So certain actions in your business have more leverage than others. Like, for example, you could spend 20 hours building a fancy website, or you could spend 20 hours of just making cold calls and booking appointments. Like, doing the cold calling thing has way more leverage. Because if your goal is to make 100 grand, then you can spend 20 hours building a fancy website and make no money, or you can spend 20 hours doing cold calls and make like $30,000, right? Now, the latter is going to move you towards your goal more. It has more leverage. So in contrast, the website is asymmetrical. So, by the way, about the website thing, we're going to give you website templates very shortly. So don't worry about the website thing and how to build a website. I'm going to just give you the templates nice and easy. But simply put, if you're wondering what to test and what experiments to run and what to focus on and when, It's as simple as basically isolating the biggest problem in the business and focusing on that. So you cannot improve the entire business at once. So your job is to find and isolate the one thing that, if fixed, is going to move you towards your goal the fastest, and you just focus on that. And the asymmetry in your business is going to be found in appointment booking, sales, or value delivery. So you want to start by experimenting with and nailing appointment booking, because if you don't, when it comes to figuring out what to test first, you always want to start by testing your appointment booking systems, because you can't run any sales experiments without appointments. And also, once you've got the appointment booking thing now, then you need to run sales experiments, because you can't run value delivery experiments without clients. So if you're wondering what to work on and what order to work on it in, and what to prioritize with your experimentation and your scientific exploration here, you start by nailing your appointment booking systems and getting those things down to a T. Then you nail the sales systems. The reason you don't try and nail the sales system before the appointment booking system is because you don't have any sales calls to practice on. How do you know if your sales script works or not if you haven't got any sales calls? And it's the same thing with trying to nail your product. You obviously want to build a great product from the outset, and I'm going to show you how to do this. But the thing is the only way you're going to get better at your product and make a better product is by having clients. And the only way you're going to get clients is by conducting sales calls. And the only way you're going to get sales calls is by getting appointments. So all of your attention should be focused at the source. It's kind of like a river. The river's not going to flow if the source is empty, right? So you experiment by getting appointments first, nail that, then you nail the sales thing, you nail that, then you nail the product thing. They obviously want to work on all three things consecutively, but if you haven't got any sales calls, then focus on getting sales calls. And if you haven't got any clients, then focus on getting sales calls. And if you haven't got client results, then focus on getting clients. You see what I mean? So at any given time in your business, there is one thing that you can experiment with and test that, if nailed, will push you 80% further towards your goal than anything else. Almost always, there's always going to be one thing. Now, you don't have a business yet, but once you do and it's up and running, you just always want to be looking for that one thing. For example, for me right now, the asymmetrical thing that I can work on is this program. This is why I'm spending a year building this thing, because it's this is the biggest point of leverage for me, because right now in my business, I need more traffic to EasyGrow, which is why I've built this program. I keep mentioning EasyGrow, as you can tell. And so, the biggest problem I have right now with my business and getting past $1 million a month is I want to do it with extreme levels of profit, which means that I need to get organic traffic and find new ways to get warm leads in who trust me and know me, who want to buy. And so the easiest way for me to do that to in a sustainable way that is very profitable is to build this course and make it available to you so that you can go through it, get results, and then buy EasyGrow. That's my intention. And that's why I'm spending a whole year on this. I've isolated the one thing that moves me towards the goal I want the most, which is 30 million a year right now. And I've no doubt we'll get to 30 million a year in due course. And this program's a huge component of that happening. Without this program, we can make it happen, but it won't be as profitable. That's my goal, right? So now we can actually look at the scientific method. So I know that we've obviously brushed over what the scientific method is, and you kind of understand it in theory. We've got the 4 steps. But what I'm going to do now is just give you a real quick rundown of a sort of test experiment, so to speak, pun not intended, because you need to know how this works. Understanding the theory of all this stuff, it should be blowing your mind, and I'm hoping you now see the world in a different way. You might want to watch this video again a couple of times. But how do we find these variables? How do we actually run empirical tests and experiments and make this happen? Well, let me introduce you to the tool that made me a literal millionaire. So this is the scientific method, and this is the business edition. So anyone who's actually a scientist, maybe you can develop some level of appreciation for me extrapolating this into business, but this is how we do it from a business standpoint. And anytime you want to run an experiment or a test, or anytime something's wrong in your business and isn't working, I need you to come back to this video and I need you to use this process. And once again, I know I'm plugging it, but in EasyGrow, I go into this in way more detail. I'm just giving you the high level for now. So the scientific method is fucking badass. It put a man on the moon. It took a picture of a black hole in space. It invented modern day medicine and much more. If it can do all of these things, it can certainly get you to a point where you're successful in business. And I know it because I used it to do it. So we have the cycle where we start by formulating our hypothesis. Once again, we're transcending the 3 levels. It can be macro, micro, or micro, micro, right? We're testing the hypothesis, we're observing the results of the test, and then we're using the results of the test to iterate a new hypothesis to run the experiment again. And the scientific method is cyclical, which means that we rotate around this cycle by formulating new hypotheses, testing them, observing them, iterating them, trying the new one out and testing again. And so in the formulate section, what we're doing here is we're defining the variables and we're creating the version of our hypothesis. Then we test it. Basically, we're exposing the hypothesis to the market to test its effectiveness. Then we're observing results, which is basically gathering data and observing the effect of the variable combination. And then we're iterating the hypothesis. So we're observing the results and getting the data, and then we're using the data to iterate the new hypothesis to hopefully make it slightly better. So we're going to be using the cold calling system from the variable map for this example. So inside of the variable map of all the variables in the consulting business, spoiler alert, there's a lot more than this, but it obviously is simplified, right? We've got this section on cold calling. So we've got the level 2 variable of the cold call system, and inside of the cold call system, we've got these level 3 variables. So to clarify, and by the way, I've changed them out slightly for this example, just to keep it simpler, but you get my point. So to clarify, the scientific method is specifically used at a micro level where we are shuffling level 3 variables to find level 2 variables that work. When we are experimenting, we are typically experimenting with the smaller variables, and this is the level that we iterate at. The objective of an experiment is to find results for a level 2 variable that are within KPI. So for example, like the level 2 variable in this question is cold calling. And if we want to fix the cold calling system, we're going to dive into the level 3 variables and we're going to start experimenting with these. And by changing these, remember, we change this, then we change the thing above it, and then we change the thing above that. So here's the steps. So step 1 is to formulate the hypothesis, or at least like, the basically the shell of the hypothesis. So I'm going to put chain. Formulate hypothesis chain. So what this means is we need to define, step 1.1 is define the key variables. So what are the variables that make up this system? There's going to be 2 to 4, no more than that. You don't really want more than 4, otherwise you get complex. You want to define the key variables. What are the things that really, really impact this system? So in this instance for cold calling, it's the gatekeeper process, the hook, and the pitch. These are the 3 things that we can play around with and change to change the cold calling system as a whole. The next step is to define the metrics and KPI. So what measurement are you actually going to use to determine if the experiment is successful? So, in this instance, the overall metric we're going to use to track the effectiveness of the change or the experiment is the appointment booking rate. But then each of these little things has its own metric. So this metric here, this big metric, is made up of little metrics. So we would have the gatekeeper bypass rate, which means if I call 100 businesses and speak to 100 gatekeepers, and a gatekeeper is like a receptionist or someone that's not the decision maker that I need to get past to obviously pitch. If I call 100 of them and I speak to 100 gatekeepers and I manage to get through to 20 decision makers, then my gatekeeper bypassing rate is 20%. And then we have the hook rate. So, your pitch rate is basically once you get through to a decision maker, how often are you able to pitch them? Because you need to say to them, look, I'm calling you, I'm trying to sell you something here. Like, can I pitch you this? So if we speak to 10 decision makers or 100 decision makers, and we try and hook them and we speak to 15, then our pitch rate is 15%. And then we have our conversion rate, which basically measures of the people that we pitched, how many of them did we convert into an appointment. Now, this is a very specific example. I know I keep repeating myself here, but in Easy Grow, this is covered in so much more detail. This is such a high, I can't even begin to explain how high level this is for acquisition, but you get the point. Metrics are made up of little metrics, which make up bigger metrics, blah, blah, blah. And then what we want to do is we want to establish the key performance indicator for each of these levels. So for example, in the cold calling section in Easy Grow, we establish the KPIs for each stage of the cold calling process so that when you're experimenting, you know specifically what to go between. And so once we've established the metrics and the KPIs we're going to use to measure them, we need to establish the sample size. So how many times are you going to test these variables? Like if you're stringing together this chain and you're going to build your own gatekeeper process, you're going to build your own hook and build your own pitch, therefore you've built your hypothesis, like how many times are we going to test these 3 variables? Well, in this instance, we try making 1,000 cold calls. This is a higher sample, so more test validity. Then we need to establish the latency and time frame. So how long will you run the test for and hit your sample size? 1.5 is make the test airtight. So then you ask yourself, what could possibly interfere with this test and skew the results at no fault of the variables? So airtight is a kind of a scientific term. Like if you've got like a Petri dish, like if you're running an experiment on like a dish of bacteria, you need to make sure that that dish is airtight. Because if there's any airborne bacteria or airborne minerals or water that can get into the experiment, it can fuck with the experiment and mess the result up. And the whole point of the scientific method is just to try and find the effectiveness of one variable. And so if you introduce a variable to a Petri dish, but then you've left the lid off, and then like now there's all these things coming into it, like it's going to mess the experiment up. Funnily enough, that's actually how penicillin was literally discovered. So, big up Joseph for that, but whatever. Anyway, so for example, with our cold calling thing, something that could mess with the results is making cold calls during Christmas. Like if we try and run the cold calling experiment during a time that no one's at work, then we're going to get bad results. Or let's say that we have a really bad internet connection or a bad phone connection. We're not going to sound like professional and people aren't going to understand us. And this is just another variable that needs to be accounted for. So before you run an experiment, make it airtight. 1.6 is create your version variables. So now that you've lined up your chain of variables, you actually need to create your hypothesis. So you create your variables to establish your hypothesis. So for example, we've got version 1 of our gatekeeper process. We've got version 1 of our hook, and we've got version 1 of our pitch. And this overall makes version 1 of our cold calling process. This is now our hypothesis, okay? And so we've got our hypothesis V1. Next, you establish the constants and the key variable. So now you define your constants, and these are part of the system, or part of the experiment rather, that directly or indirectly affect the ability of the variable, to perform its function. And they must be held constant while it's running. So what this means is when you've got these things that you're looking to test, everything else in the experiment must be the same. So let's say that you make your first 500 calls with a USA number, with a USA phone number, but then you make your next 500 calls with a UK phone number. And then let's say there's a difference between those two things. Like you no longer know now whether the change was because of the change to your key variables or because you changed your phone number. So for example, in cold calling, every call you must have the same tone of voice. You must have the same speech pacing, which is basically how quickly you talk. You've got to use the same lead sourcing techniques. You've got to use the same of everything basically. You've got to call at the same time of the day, because if during this experiment, 20% of the time you're calling at 3 p.m., 50% of the time you're calling at 7 p.m., and then 10% you're calling at 9 a.m., whatever, like these things are variables. And the time of day you call is going to impact the experiment in some way, shape, or form. And the problem is that if you vary anything else other than the one thing that you're trying to test, you no longer know what caused the result to happen. And so basically, ask yourself, what could influence the outcome of this experiment other than the variables? So, different tonality, etc., etc. And this is called ceteris paribus. So ceteris paribus is an incredibly important idea, and it's Latin for all other things staying the same except for one. And ceteris paribus is the fundamental foundation of the scientific method. Because the thing is when you're running an experiment, you can only test one thing at a time. One key variable can be changed at a time. Everything else must be held constant and the same. If you try testing two things at once and you observe a change, then you have absolutely no idea what brought that change on, so you can only test one variable at a time. What we're trying to do with experimentation and iteration in the scientific method is we're trying to determine cause and effect. And if you change multiple causes and you get a different effect, you no longer know what caused that effect, which means that you can't make accurate decisions and you're going to confuse yourself. So step 2 is to test the hypothesis. So, you've got your version 1, let it run. Step 2.2 is do nothing. So whilst the test is running, do not fuck with the test. Don't make any changes. You're going to have every emotional impulse under the sun to fuck around with it, but don't. Let it run. Decide how many you're going to do and then run it. Remember, we're just here to experiment. We're not here to try and build a business or be successful. We're just trying to run experiments. Obviously, you want to build a business to be successful, but the way you do that is by unemotionally running experiments. The one enemy of science is emotion. And if you bring emotion and impulse and change into your experiments, like if you get 500 cold calls in and then you find a fucking video on TikTok, because you're an idiot and you're on TikTok, and then you find like, oh, on TikTok, I saw this guy say this thing, so I'm going to change this. No. Ceteris paribus. Iron mind. No emotion, no impulse, no change. One variable at a time. Be patient. Step 2.3 is log the data. So what's going to happen as you run the test is you're going to start to observe data. So you want to observe what's happening and keep a daily log of the data in a spreadsheet. So for example, I borrowed this from EasyGrow. This is the cold calling metrics spreadsheet that we use. And so what this allows you to do every day is log down like how many calls have you made, how many DMs have you pitched. If you're testing your gatekeeper script, you're going to log in like how many people have picked up, how many gatekeepers have answered, etc., etc. And you've got all of these things that you're going to log every single day to measure the effectiveness of the cold calling system. And you need to log your data every day because the only point of doing the scientific method is getting data. The whole reason like we do this is actually just to get data so we can make better decisions. Building a business and becoming successful is about making the right decision consecutively over and over again. And the only way to make the right decision is to know it's the right decision. And the only way to know it's the right decision is by looking at data. Data and numbers will tell you what is right and what is wrong. And so this is why we do this. We're not doing this for any other reason than knowing what the right decision is every time. And the only way we know it's right is by testing an accurate, empirical, statistical observation, which is why you must log your metrics every time, okay? And I've got metrics, in all of these folders up here. All of these are basically just metric folders, that tell me different things about my business. So step 3 is observe results. So the next thing to do in 3.1 is verify the data. So before you make any decisions, just check your data and make sure that you've logged it properly and it's accurate and there's no anomalies. There might be anomalies, but make sure that they're not of your own fault. Step 3.2 is determine success. So then what we're doing is we're sort of coming back to this diagram here and we're asking ourselves, we've got our baseline, which is where we were when we started the experiment. So was the experiment successful? Did this experiment deliver results within KPI? Did you progress away from baseline towards goal, or did you regress away from baseline towards hell? And so, every experiment has an outcome, and the outcome can be measured on this nice little abstract diagram here. That's basically, how you know if you're doing the right thing or not. And then step 4 is iterating hypothesis. So once we've built a hypothesis, right, like this, and then gone out to test it and gather the data and observe the results and make sure they're good, well, now we can iterate the hypothesis. So, the step 4.1 is to redefine key variables. So if appropriate, you may need to run more experiments to find KPI, to get into that point of success or to hit that goal. And if so, then you renote your key variables and the result they delivered. So for example, if I know that gatekeeper process V1, hook V1, and pitch V1 delivered an appointment booking rate of, let's say, 2%, then we've established empirically in our market, at this moment in time, in our environment, that this collection of variables delivers on average a 2% appointment booking rate. Okay, do you have any idea how big that is to understand? You now have an advantage. You now know that something works in a certain way. And if you do this hundreds of times, you're going to know hundreds of things that work. And so what you need to do now is recognize, okay, well, appointment booking rate of 2% might not be what we want. So the next thing to do is to pick the needle mover variable, because we're going to run another experiment, because we want this ABR to be like 5%. So if we want to get to 5%, then we need to iterate away from this and try and improve it. So the next experiment is to pick the needle mover variable. So to improve our appointment booking rate, you need to decide which variable you want to test. So now we're no longer going to be testing all 3 at once. We're just going to be testing one at a time. So let me explain. So remember, you can only test one thing at a time. So after you've done your original version 1 test, you can now only test one variable at a time. So you need to now decide logically which variable, if changed in the right way, is going to have the biggest impact. So for example, with these metrics here, in your last experiment, you might have really nailed the gatekeeper process. Maybe you get through the decision maker all the time. You also might have no trouble hooking decision makers and getting to the pitch. So the data will tell you, because if your gatekeeper bypassing rate is like 95% and your pitch rate is like 92%, but your appointment booking rate is 2%, then you know there's no problem with your gatekeeper process and no problem with your hook. So you want to get metrics and measure metrics for each stage of these processes, and then that way you know exactly where you're going right and where you're going wrong. And so what we would do in this case, if your gatekeeper process was in KPI and your hook process was in KPI, then you would iterate the pitch variable, because you can get through the decision maker and you can pitch them real easy, but the problem is actually saying the right thing to get them to convert. And so here we would edit the pitch, right? So step 4.3 is to recognize these new constants. So once you've decided the needle mover variable the other two variables in this instance, or the other variables that you were experimenting with before, they now become constants in the next experiment. You cannot change them. If you want to fairly assess the impact of the needle mover variable, remember, ceteris paribus, you can only iterate one variable at a time. So what we're going to do, and I'm going to show this in a second here, is we're going to keep version 1 of Gatekeeper. We're going to keep version 1 of script, but we're going to change the pitch. And so, by changing the pitch to version 2, we now have the cold calling process version 2, which we can now run the experiment again with another 1,000 dials. And once we've done 1,000 dials, we can look at the test and say, oh, maybe our appointment booking rate has gone to 3.7%. It's moved up. Or maybe it's gone down to 0.7%. It's moved down. So we come back to version 1 and we experiment again, right? But in order to make the change, you need to pick your modification level. So when you're modifying your needle moving variable, you need to decide how much. So you either modify it slightly. So if the result of the first experiment is kind of okay and kind of in line with the goal, then you're only going to slightly modify the thing, because you don't want to change it completely because you're nearly there. If it's kind of off, then you do moderate modification, which means the next version has some affinity. It's somewhat similar to the existing version. But if you completely botch the experiment, if version 1 is completely off, and your appointment booking rate is like 0.3%, even though your gatekeeper rate and your hook rate was fine, then you're going to do complete modification, which means that the next version that you create of this needle moving variable has absolutely no affinity to the existing version, right? So affinity just means similar to, right? So you can modify at 3 different levels. And knowing what type of modification to pick just depends on how far away you are from KPI off of the first experiment. And so 4.5, using this modification technique, is recreate your version 2 hypothesis. So we hold the original variables, except from the one we want to change, constant, which means that we make no changes. We change one thing, and then we've got our version 2. And then step 4.6 is repeat step 1. So then we come all the way back to step 1, where we formulate our hypothesis, and then we just run the experiment again. And this is where this sort of cyclical thing, it comes in cyclically. So we created the hypothesis, we tested it over 1,000 calls, we observed the results, we got 2% ABR, and then we've iterated our hypothesis to create version 2. And now we've this is all of the same thing. So we need to test it again, observe and iterate and keep going. And we cycle around. And after doing this, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, we'll find a cold calling script or a cold calling process that just works. Or you could buy Easy Row, but I'm giving you the tools you need in case you don't want to, right? So you basically take your new hypothesis and run it through the same test that you ran version 1 through. Now remember that you must follow all 6 of the rules laid out at the start of step 3 before drawing conclusions. So make sure that you've got a good sample size, you've accounted for latency, which basically just means that you're accounting for any delays. But actually this is kind of latencies are more advanced we won't worry about that. We won't concern ourselves with that. Don't worry about it, basically. It's only for much more complicated experiments at a significantly higher level of business. So don't worry. Make sure you've got all these things in a row. And this is basically how you build everything in your business. This is the scientific method. Now, people kind of get this. You might have heard gurus before who talk about A/B split tests, where they're like, oh yeah, just split test it, bro. They're all on the right track because that's kind of a scientific test, but this is an A/B split test on steroids, and this is how you really should think. So anytime someone just says they need to do an A/B split test, it can sometimes be appropriate, but you need to kind of do your A/B split tests thoroughly and like this, okay? So if you follow all 18 of these steps, and there's 18 of these steps, I thought there was only 14 or 13. I made this document a while ago. If you follow all 18 of these steps properly, you literally cannot fail. And I mean this in every sense of the word. The only variable is time. You just need to give the scientific method enough time to work and shuffle variables. It will take time, but it will work. If you actually follow the scientific method, if you actually do this cyclical thing, you cannot fail. For as long as you keep trying, you can't fail anyway, by definition. But this is how you find anything that works. Unless you get really lucky, then you've got to do the scientific method. And I'm sure you don't want to rely on luck as a strategy in business, because it's a pretty bad one. So that's the scientific method, business edition. And you can also open up a summary of all the steps here, and you can observe them. That shouldn't be there. And you can observe them here, okay? So we'll just get rid of this. And then you've got the summary. So you can see all of the steps to the scientific method in a nice, neat little order here. Okay. Now, the last thing we're going to look at is variation. So we've kind of covered variation. Once again, this is a topic that in Easy Grow is just like, there's like a whole thing on it, but I'm just going to cover it quickly here because you need to know it. So as you should recall from earlier, information is the bedrock of a business. It is used to change level 3 variables that in turn have a major impact on the business as a whole. The quality of the information that you have determines the quality of your business. Now, variation of information is the key to this whole thing. So in the same way that, like, you know, if a spider lays eggs and if it hatches 500 spiderlings, you know, all of those spiderlings will be slightly different to, you know, basically account for the change in environment. This is because your environment, sorry, I'm going to start this bit again. Variation of information is the key to the whole thing. It's been a long video. This is because your experiments can only be as good as the information informing them. So this is a really important thing. Like, a good scientist is only a good scientist because they know what to test, right? Now, obviously, we can remove the emotion and do the empirical experiments and stuff, but you need to have the right information. Without variation, entire species will die and businesses will fail. This is why most people suck at business, by the way. Like, this is why most of these sort of startup business online courses and videos do not help. So I'm sure you've done this before or seen this before where, you know, some guru is selling like a course and, you know, it kind of sucks and no one really gets results, and it's because there's no variation. Like, everyone has the same thing. It's like, you know, they say like, you know, oh, just sell this one thing on Amazon, or like, this is the best drop shipping product to sell. And then everyone does it, and then it's no longer the best thing to sell because there's no variation, right? And this is how we die. So this is why I've not given you the best niche or the best service, because then everyone would copy it and there would be no variation, and as a species we would die. And I'm responsible for you guys, so I don't want you to die, right? At least in a business sense, or not personally, of course. Although I don't know you, I would rather you didn't die, right? So anyway, like, I'm not biasing you towards a niche or a service in any way. This is going to be the same thing when we come to the cold email and the cold calling and the cold DM and the content processes. Like, I'm not going to give you, like, you know, say exactly this, because if you do that, it won't work because everyone will do it. Now, in Easy Grow, we do that because in Easy Grow, there's only like 1,000 people, you know, or like it's a much more elite group. But with the size of this community, as I'm sure you've observed, if I unleash like a new cold email like template, everyone's going to use it and it's going to stop working. So I can do that in Easy Grow, which is why we do, because there's less people using it. But at this level, not going to happen. But I'm still going to give you the best training that you're ever going to find at this level for acquisition. Don't worry about that. But my point here is we're going to go through principles, we're going to go through ideas, we're going to go through how to do it, not just do this, because you can't copy and paste your way to success. You can if you're the only person copying and pasting, but the second that like more than one person does, it doesn't work. So variation is the key to evolutionary success. It's the random mutation of genes that has brought about humans, owls, willow trees, and all successful species we know today. This program will give you the variables you need to succeed, but I implore you to introduce your own calculated and random variation. So there are countless combinations of variables that we can combine to test, and there is no end to variation. You can have as much fun as you want with it, and you can apply almost anything to business to see if it works. My best systems that I've ever made have not been copy and pasted. They are the result of relentless iteration of random variables. Now, this is kind of a key word here, is this word randomness, because this is how nature does it. Like, nature's only tool for variation is randomness. So you know how on that game show, like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, you get to phone a friend. If you're not sure what to do, you phone a friend. Well, when it comes to client acquisition or business, I'll put business here specifically. When it comes to business, that friend is randomness. So if you're ever stuck in a corner or snookered or trying to build a business system, try randomness. I'm not even joking. Turn to a random page in a random book, pick a random line, and see how you can apply it to your business. Learn from nature, because you never know what you're going to discover. Like, you want to become this mad scientist, basically, and you want to become random and somewhat unpredictable. Like, you know, if I'm building a new, like, if I'm making like a YouTube video and I'm trying to think of like a hook for a YouTube video, like, I'm not even joking. Sometimes if I'm not sure what to say in the hook, I'll just go to my library, pick out a random book, a random page, shut my eyes, point at one word, and I'll see if I can build the hook around that word. And it works. Like, you know, because if you're using randomness and you're really truly experiencing variation in your business, then no one's going to be like you. A lot of the time it won't work. And this is why, like, you know, in nature, like, most of the variants are not preferable. Like, most information you find for your business will not be good, and most of it will suck. But sometimes you'll come across something that just changes the game completely. And the only way you're going to do that is by just trying things that are random. Now, not completely random, obviously they have to make sense, but I'm hoping you can get the point. I'm hoping you can understand. So variation is the key of evolution. And once you understand that and you use it, you'll crush everyone. So just to sort of summarize this video in a sentence or two, maybe I could have saved you the time, but I think giving you the context and the full understanding was important. You know this phrase of if at first you don't succeed, try and try again? Well, that's for idiots. Because if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, then you're insane. And that's not the definition of insanity, but a popularized one. Like, if you try something and it doesn't work and you try it again, it's not going to work again. You must shuffle variables and you must have variation. So if at first you don't succeed, iterate and then try and try again. Okay? This line here is bullshit. Because if you do something and it doesn't work and you do it again, it's not going to work again. But if you do something and it doesn't work, you look at why it didn't work, you look at the feedback, and then you iterate what you did, and then you try that new thing, then it might work. Okay? That's the lesson of this video. So in this video, we've gone through the iteration explained. We've gone through iteration explained. We've gone through meta-long evolution, DNA, applied evolutionary biology. We've been through the scientific method twice. We kind of went through that twice. Macro versus micro iteration, iterating towards goal, measuring experimental outcomes, metrics, variation, asymmetry in a scientific method. We've been through this. This has been a bit of a mission. This video has taken me nearly 3 weeks to make, to be completely honest with you. And I hope that it serves you well. And I hope that, you've taken what you need to know from this. And I implore you to just rewatch this thing because this really is the secret. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care.